Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. Tonight I'm winding down in my quiet little Stardew corner, and we've got some unbelievable stories lined up, mostly about the kind of neighbours, roommates and co-workers you wouldn't believe existed. You know the type, the ones who push things way too far until karma finally steps in. That might sound a little strange, but there's something undeniably calming about hearing weird people eat some karma pie while the world around you slows down. The lights are low, the game sounds are soft, and let's just sink into these stories for a cozy eve. I've been doom scrolling through Reddit, finding the most entertaining and satisfying tales people have shared. Some of them might be real, others might be too perfect to believe, but each one will leave you with that cozy vibes. So grab a tea, get comfortable, and let's drift into the sometimes random world of Reddit. Our first story comes from someone who discovered that their co-worker's elaborate scheme to avoid work was about to backfire in the most spectacular way possible. I work in IT support for a mid-sized company, and for the past year I've been dealing with a co-worker named Matthew who had perfected the art of looking busy while doing absolutely nothing. Matthew was a master of what I call performance productivity. He'd always be in meetings, always be on calls, always be working on some urgent project that kept him too busy to handle actual support tickets. Management loved him because he seemed so engaged and proactive, while the rest of our team was drowning in work that Matthew somehow never had time to help with. The thing about Matthew was that he'd figured out how to game every metric our department used to measure productivity. He'd open support tickets and immediately close them as duplicates or non-issues, artificially inflating his resolution numbers. He'd schedule meetings with himself or with people who didn't actually exist, filling his calendar to make it look like he was constantly engaged in important work. He'd send emails at odd hours to create the impression that he was working around the clock, even though I knew he was just scheduling them to send automatically. What really bothered me was how Matthew would volunteer for high visibility projects and then quietly delegate all the actual work to other team members while taking full credit during presentations to management. He had this talent for being in the right place at the right time to claim ownership of successful initiatives, while somehow being unavailable whenever things went wrong or when unglamorous maintenance work needed to be done. I tried talking to our manager about Matthew's lack of actual contribution, but Matthew had been so effective at managing his image that my complaints sounded like jealousy or poor teamwork. He'd cultivated this reputation as the department's strategic thinker and innovator, while the rest of us were supposedly just tactical support workers who didn't understand the bigger picture. The breaking point came during our annual performance review cycle. Matthew received the highest rating in our department, along with a substantial bonus and a promotion to senior IT specialist. Meanwhile, those of us who'd been handling triple the workload received standard ratings and minimal increases. Management praised Matthew's leadership and vision, while suggesting the rest of us needed to think more strategically about our contributions. That's when I decided Matthew needed to experience what happens when his carefully constructed facade of productivity gets stress tested by reality. I knew our company was planning a major system migration that would require genuine technical expertise and hands-on work. It was the kind of project that couldn't be faked with meetings and strategic emails. Someone would actually have to understand our infrastructure, write migration scripts, troubleshoot problems, and work directly with our systems. I volunteered to help plan the migration project, and during the planning meetings, I made sure to emphasize how this would be a perfect opportunity for our senior IT specialists to demonstrate their technical leadership. I talked about how the project would require deep system knowledge and hands-on implementation work from our most experienced team members. Management agreed and assigned Matthew as the technical lead for the migration, citing his proven track record of successful project delivery. Matthew was thrilled with the assignment because it was highly visible and came with the opportunity to present results directly to executive leadership. He immediately started scheduling planning meetings and sending strategic emails about migration philosophy and change management principles. He created elaborate project timelines and communication plans that looked impressive in PowerPoint but contained zero actual technical content. What Matthew didn't realise was that I'd been documenting our infrastructure in meticulous detail for months. I'd created comprehensive documentation of every system dependency, every custom configuration, and every potential migration challenge. I'd also been the one actually doing the technical work that Matthew had been taking credit for, so I understood our environment better than anyone else in the department. When Matthew started asking for technical details to include in his migration plan, I provided him with accurate but highly complex information that required genuine understanding to implement. I explained database replication strategies, network routing configurations, and application dependency chains in technical language that Matthew clearly didn't comprehend but pretended to follow. Matthew's migration plan was predictably superficial. It included generic best practices, copied from internet articles, and vague timelines that didn't account for any of the specific complexities of our environment. When he presented it to the executive team, they were impressed by his confident delivery and professional presentation, and they approved the project to move forward with Matthew as the technical lead. The actual migration was scheduled for a weekend when Matthew would need to be on site to oversee the technical implementation. This was where Matthew's complete lack of real technical knowledge would become impossible to hide. There would be no meetings to schedule, no strategic emails to send, no credit to steal from other people's work. Just Matthew, alone in the data center, responsible for executing a complex technical migration that he didn't understand. I made sure I was unavailable that weekend by scheduling a family trip that had been planned for months. I documented this time off well in advance and made it clear that I wouldn't be reachable during the migration window. Several other team members also arranged to be away, leaving Matthew without his usual safety net of people whose work he could claim as his own. The Friday before the migration, Matthew started showing signs of panic. He was asking increasingly specific technical questions that revealed his fundamental lack of understanding about our systems. He tried to reschedule the migration, but executive leadership had already communicated the timeline to the entire company, and rescheduling would have been a major embarrassment. Matthew attempted to get me to cancel my family plans and be available as backup support during the migration. I politely declined, explaining that my family had been looking forward to this trip for months, and that as senior IT specialist and technical lead, Matthew certainly had the expertise to handle the migration independently. I reminded him that this was his opportunity to demonstrate the technical leadership that had earned him his recent promotion. The migration weekend was apparently a disaster. Matthew managed to begin the initial steps by following the documented procedures I'd created, but when he encountered the inevitable, unexpected issues that arise during complex migrations, he had no idea how to troubleshoot or adapt. He made several critical errors that cascaded into larger problems, ultimately causing system outages that extended well beyond the planned maintenance window. By Monday morning, several critical business systems were still offline or functioning improperly. Matthew had worked through the entire weekend trying to fix problems he'd created, and he looked absolutely destroyed. The executive team was furious about the extended outages and the impact on business operations. I came back from my family trip to find Matthew in an emergency meeting with management, trying to explain what had gone wrong. He attempted to blame inadequate documentation and lack of team support, but management pointed out that he'd been given weeks to prepare and had assured everyone that he had the technical expertise to lead the migration successfully. Over the next few days, I quietly fixed all the problems Matthew had created during the failed migration. I documented each error he'd made and explained to management what should have been done differently. The contrast between Matthew's panicked flailing and my calm, competent problem solving made it very clear who actually understood our systems. The investigation that followed revealed Matthew's entire pattern of fake productivity. Management discovered his phantom meetings, his automated emails, and his history of taking credit for other people's technical work. They realised that his impressive track record had been built on appropriating contributions from team members who were too focused on actual work to worry about proper attribution. Matthew was demoted back to his original position and placed on a performance improvement plan that required him to handle actual support tickets and demonstrate real technical skills. His bonus was rescinded and he was required to repay a portion of it due to the costs associated with fixing his migration mistakes. Within 2 months, Matthew resigned rather than continue working in an environment where he actually had to do the job he'd been pretending to do for years. The new senior IT specialist position went to someone who'd been quietly doing excellent technical work without the need for elaborate performance theatre. That story shows that you can fake competence with meetings and emails for a while, but eventually reality demands actual skills, and that's when people who've been coasting on other people's work get exposed in the most humiliating way possible. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that their seemingly perfect roommate had been living a double life that was about to unravel in the most unexpected way. I thought I'd hit the roommate jackpot when Sarah responded to my apartment listing last spring. She was quiet, clean, always paid rent early, and seemed to have her life completely together. She worked from home doing something with digital consulting, kept to herself mostly, and we had a perfectly pleasant but not overly friendly relationship. For the first few months, everything was ideal. Sarah was basically invisible in the best possible way. She'd emerge from her room occasionally to use the kitchen or bathroom, exchange pleasantries, and then disappear back into her space. Her rent checks arrived like clockwork, usually several days before they were due, and she never created any drama or issues. The first hint that something was off came about 4 months into our living arrangement. I came home early from work one afternoon and heard Sarah on a phone call in her room. The walls in our apartment are pretty thin, and I couldn't help but overhear parts of the conversation. She was speaking in a completely different voice, higher pitched and with an accent I'd never heard her use before. She was calling someone darling and talking about meeting up later at some restaurant I'd never heard her mention. I brushed it off as maybe she was practicing for an acting audition or doing some kind of voice work for her consulting business. Sarah had always been a bit mysterious about the specifics of her job, and I figured digital consulting could involve all sorts of weird projects. But then I started noticing other strange details that didn't quite add up. Sarah would leave the apartment dressed in conservative business casual clothes, but I'd occasionally see someone who looked exactly like her around our neighbourhood wearing completely different outfits and styles. Once I could have sworn I saw her at a coffee shop wearing punk rock clothing with bright pink hair extensions, but when I mentioned seeing someone who looked like her, Sarah seemed confused and said she'd been home working all day. The packages started arriving constantly. Multiple deliveries every single day, all addressed to different names. Sarah Chen, Sarah Martinez, Sarah Williams, sometimes just S. Chen or S. Martinez. When I asked about it casually, Sarah laughed and said she did product testing and reviews as a side business, which required ordering items under different accounts to avoid bias in the algorithms. It sounded plausible enough, though something about her explanation felt rehearsed. Then I noticed the wigs. I'd gone into Sarah's room once when she'd locked herself out and asked me to grab her keys from her desk. On top of her closet were at least a dozen wig boxes, and inside her closet I could see multiple completely different wardrobes organised by style. Professional business wear in one section, casual athletic clothes in another, gothic and alternative fashion in a third section, and even what looked like costume pieces or formal evening wear. I started paying more attention after that, and the evidence kept piling up. Sarah had multiple phones that would ring at different times with different ringtones. She'd answer them using different names and different voices. She had various ID cards and credit cards scattered around, all with her photo, but different names, and sometimes different signatures. Her mail came addressed to at least 7 different variations of her name. The breakthrough came when I recognised Sarah on a dating app, while mindlessly swiping one evening, except it wasn't the Sarah I knew. This profile showed her with red hair, listed a completely different job, different hobbies, and a different age. The photos were definitely her, but the entire persona was someone else entirely. Out of curiosity, I kept swiping and found 3 more profiles over the next few days, each presenting a completely different version of Sarah with different looks, careers, and personalities. That's when I realised what Sarah was actually doing. She wasn't just living a double life. She was living about 7 or 8 different lives simultaneously. Different boyfriends or girlfriends who knew her by different names, different friend groups who thought she had different careers, different online personas that had nothing to do with each other. Sarah had created an entire network of separate identities and was somehow managing to keep them all running without any of these worlds colliding. I didn't know whether to be impressed or horrified. The level of organisation and compartmentalisation required to maintain this many separate lives was honestly extraordinary. She had to remember which personality went with which name, which backstory belonged to which identity, and keep all these different relationships and commitments from overlapping. It was like watching someone play chess on 8 boards simultaneously while also juggling. I debated whether to confront her about what I'd discovered, but I was genuinely curious about how long she could maintain this elaborate structure. So instead, I started documenting everything. I took note of when she left us different versions of herself, tracked the various names on her packages and mail, and even created a spreadsheet mapping out her different identities based on the evidence I could observe. What I discovered was actually fascinating from a psychological perspective. Business Sarah seemed to exist Monday through Wednesday, meeting with clients and maintaining a professional consulting career. Athletic Sarah appeared on Thursday mornings for yoga classes and running groups. Alternative Sarah emerged on Friday and Saturday nights for concerts and art events. Sophisticated Sarah attended gallery openings and wine tastings on Sunday afternoons. And there were at least 3 other distinct personas that appeared at various times for specific purposes. The system worked perfectly until Sarah made one critical mistake. She scheduled 2 different dates with 2 different people at the same restaurant on the same night. I only knew about this because I happened to be at that exact restaurant with some coworkers for a happy hour gathering. I watched the whole thing unfold from across the room. Sarah arrived first as her sophisticated persona, dressed elegantly and meeting a man in an expensive suit. They were seated at a table near the window. About 20 minutes later, a different guy walked in, clearly looking for someone, and I realised with growing horror that he was looking for Sarah. She'd apparently scheduled another date as her alternative persona and had somehow mixed up either the time or the location. I watched Sarah's face go through about 15 different expressions as she saw her second date walking toward the host's stand. She excused herself from her first date, claiming she needed to use the restroom, but I could see her intercepting the second guy near the entrance. She was clearly trying to reschedule or redirect him, but he seemed confused and insistent about their plans. That's when the first date came looking for her, worried that something was wrong. Both men ended up standing near the entrance with 2 completely different versions of Sarah, and you could see the moment when they both realised something very strange was happening. One of them literally pulled out his phone to show the other guy Sarah's dating profile, and they discovered they'd been talking to what they thought were 2 entirely different women who just happened to look identical. The confrontation moved outside, and I paid my bill and positioned myself where I could watch the drama unfold through the window. Sarah was trying to explain, switching between her 2 personas, and getting increasingly flustered as both men demanded answers. Within minutes, they'd both walked away, leaving Sarah standing alone on the sidewalk, looking absolutely defeated. When Sarah came home that night, she looked exhausted in a way I'd never seen before. Her carefully maintained composure had cracked, and she just looked like someone who'd been running a marathon for months and had finally hit the wall. I made tea and we sat down for what turned out to be a 4-hour conversation about her elaborate system of multiple identities. Sarah explained that it had started small, just creating a different online persona to explore interests she felt didn't match her professional image. But it had snowballed over the years into this complex web of separate lives that she felt trapped inside. She was terrified that if any of these worlds discovered the others, her entire carefully constructed reality would collapse. She'd been living in constant fear of exactly what had happened at the restaurant, and now that it had finally occurred, she felt almost relieved. Over the next few weeks, Sarah systematically dismantled her various alternate identities. She came clean to the people she'd been deceiving, closed down fake social media accounts, and started seeing a therapist to understand why she'd felt compelled to fragment herself into so many different personas. Some relationships survived the revelation, while others understandably ended when people learned they'd been dating someone who didn't actually exist. Sarah moved out a few months later, not because of any conflict between us, but because she needed a fresh start in a place where she could figure out who she actually was without the weight of all her previous deceptions. Before she left, she thanked me for not immediately confronting her or exposing her, and for being someone safe enough to finally be honest with when everything fell apart. That story proves that living multiple lives might seem like an escape from limitations or a way to explore different aspects of yourself. But eventually, the complexity becomes its own prison, and the only real freedom comes from being authentically yourself, even if that self is messy, contradictory, or still figuring things out. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that their grandmother had been secretly running an underground poker operation, and the family intervention went hilariously wrong. My grandmother Beatrice is 83 years old, lives alone in a modest house in suburban Phoenix, and according to my family, needed to be moved into assisted living because she was becoming forgetful and couldn't take care of herself properly. My parents and aunts had been discussing this for months, worried about her safety and independence. They'd noticed she was frequently unavailable when they called, sometimes seemed confused about her schedule, and had been making unusual cash withdrawals from her bank account that suggested she might be getting scammed or losing track of her finances. The family decided to stage an intervention. We all showed up at her house on a Tuesday afternoon, unannounced, ready to have a serious conversation about her declining capacity and the need for professional care. My mum had researched several nice facilities in the area and had brochures ready to show Grandma Beatrice. My aunt had prepared a whole speech about dignity and safety. My uncle had even consulted with an elder care attorney about the legal process for transitioning someone into assisted living if they resisted. We knocked on the door and let ourselves in with the spare key when Grandma didn't answer immediately. What we found inside was absolutely not what any of us expected. The living room had been completely transformed into a professional poker setup. There were 2 high-quality poker tables with proper felt surfaces, dealer buttons, and chip trays. The dining room had been converted into a bar area with top-shelf liquor and a commercial-grade ice maker. The back bedroom that used to be my grandfather's office was now a lounge with leather recliners and a massive television showing sports channels. Sitting around the poker tables were 11 elderly people, most of whom I vaguely recognised from around the neighbourhood or from Grandma's church. They all froze when we walked in, looking like teenagers who'd just been caught throwing a house party. Grandma Beatrice was standing at one of the tables wearing a dealer's visor and holding a deck of cards in the middle of dealing what looked like a serious hand of Texas Hold'em. The silence lasted for about 5 seconds before my grandmother said, in the most dignified voice possible, that we should have called before coming over, because Tuesday afternoons were her hosting day and she had guests. My mother, completely stunned, asked what exactly was happening here. That's when we learned that Grandma Beatrice had been running a twice-weekly poker game for the past 4 years, ever since Grandpa died, and she'd been looking for something to keep herself busy and social. But this wasn't just a casual card game with penny antes. Grandma had established a serious underground poker operation with buy-ins ranging from $50 to $200 depending on the game. She had regular players who came twice a week, occasional high-stakes games once a month, and had even developed a reputation in the senior gambling community that extended beyond her immediate neighbourhood. People were driving from across the valley to play in Beatrice's games because she ran them professionally, kept the house fair, and created a comfortable environment for older players who didn't want to deal with the chaos of casinos. My grandmother explained all of this calmly, while her poker players sat there trying to look innocent, like they'd just been caught doing something mildly embarrassing rather than participating in what was technically illegal gambling. She walked us through her whole operation with obvious pride. She'd learned to deal professionally by watching YouTube videos and practicing for months. She'd invested in quality equipment to make the games feel legitimate. She'd established house rules that kept everything fair and prevented arguments. She even had a rotation system for providing snacks and had partnered with a friend who catered the monthly high-stakes games. The financial aspect was what really shocked my parents. Grandma wasn't losing money to scams or suffering from declining mental capacity. She was making a profit as the house. She charged a small rake on each pot, sold drinks and snacks at modest markups, and cleared between $400 and $800 per week from her operation. Over 4 years, she'd saved nearly $100,000 from her poker business, money she'd been keeping in a separate bank account that none of us knew about. My uncle, who's an accountant, immediately started asking questions about taxes and legal liability. Grandma Beatrice pulled out a folder with meticulous records of every game, every transaction, and every expense. She'd been documenting everything and had apparently consulted with a lawyer about the legal grey areas of home poker games. According to her research, as long as she wasn't advertising publicly, wasn't taking a rake above certain limits, and wasn't operating as a commercial establishment, she was operating in a legal grey area that was technically permissible under Arizona law. My aunt, recovering from her initial shock, asked why Grandma hadn't told anyone in the family about this. Grandma's response was perfect. She said that she was an adult woman who'd raised 4 children, buried a husband, and managed a household for 60 years, and she didn't need permission from her children to have hobbies or run a small business. She pointed out that everyone had assumed she was declining and needed help, when in reality she was sharper and more active than she'd been in years. The poker games kept her mind engaged, gave her a social community, and provided supplemental income that made her feel independent and capable. One of the poker players, a man named Harold, who turned out to be a retired mathematics professor, jumped in to defend Grandma. He explained that their poker group was actually a tight-knit community of retirees who'd all found friendship and mental stimulation through the games. Several of them had been widowed or were dealing with isolation, and Beatrice's poker games had given them something to look forward to and a reason to stay socially engaged. Harold said that Beatrice was actually providing a valuable service for elderly people who wanted the social aspects of gambling without the depressing atmosphere of casinos or the predatory nature of commercial card rooms. My mother was struggling to process all of this information. She kept looking around at the professional setup, the organised cash boxes, the clearly established system, and trying to reconcile it with her image of her elderly mother who supposedly needed help managing her daily life. She finally asked about the confusion over Grandma's schedule and the unreturned phone calls that had sparked concern about her mental state. Grandma explained that she'd been screening calls during poker games because interruptions disrupted the flow and weren't professional. She'd been vague about her schedule, because she didn't want family members showing up unannounced during games, which is exactly what had just happened. The cash withdrawals were for buying supplies, paying out winners, and maintaining her poker bankroll. Everything that had looked like signs of decline was actually evidence of a well-run small business operation. The family intervention completely fell apart at that point. My dad started laughing and couldn't stop. My uncle began examining Grandma's financial records with what looked like professional admiration for her bookkeeping. My aunt seemed torn between being scandalised and being impressed. My mother just kept shaking her head and saying she couldn't believe this was happening. Grandma Beatrice, sensing that she'd successfully defended her operation, asked if we were finished interrupting her game because her players had money on the table and were waiting to continue. She suggested that if we wanted to talk further, we could come back literally any other day of the week when she wasn't hosting, or we could sit quietly in the other room and wait for the game to finish. She was not about to shut down her business because her children had shown up unannounced with misguided concerns about her independence. We ended up staying and watching the rest of the game. It was actually fascinating to see how professionally Grandma ran everything. She dealt quickly and accurately, managed the pot efficiently, kept conversation friendly but focused, and maintained control of the table like someone who'd been doing this for decades rather than 4 years. Her players clearly respected her and the environment she'd created. They chatted between hands about grandchildren and health issues and retirement activities, but during hands, they were focused and serious about their poker. The family meeting about assisted living never actually happened. Instead, we had a very different conversation the next day about respecting Grandma's autonomy and maybe not assuming that elderly people need intervention just because they have lives and activities we don't know about. My parents apologised for planning to make major decisions about her life without fully understanding her situation. Grandma graciously accepted the apology and then invited all of us to her next monthly high-stakes game, suggesting that if we wanted to be involved in her life, we should actually participate rather than just making assumptions. I've been to 3 of Grandma Beatrice's games since then, and I've lost money every single time. She's genuinely skilled at poker, and her regular players have been doing this long enough that they're actually quite good. The experience completely changed how I think about aging and independence. My grandmother isn't declining or losing capacity. She's running a successful business, maintaining an active social life, and staying mentally sharp through strategic gaming. That story teaches us that sometimes the people we think need help are actually doing just fine, and our desire to take care of them says more about our own anxieties than it does about their actual capabilities or needs. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that their local coffee shop had been systematically overcharging customers and found the perfect way to expose the scheme without causing a scene. I'm a regular at a small independent coffee shop called Brew Haven that's walking distance from my apartment. I'd been going there almost every morning for about 2 years, always ordering the same thing, a large cappuccino and a blueberry muffin. The owner Marcus seemed like a nice enough guy, always friendly and chatty, and I genuinely enjoyed supporting a local business instead of going to the corporate chain down the street. About 6 months ago, I started noticing small inconsistencies in what I was being charged. Some days my usual order would be $7.50. Other days it would be $8.25, and occasionally it would be as high as $9. At first I figured maybe Marcus was adjusting prices to deal with inflation or supply costs, which seemed reasonable enough. Coffee beans and ingredients do fluctuate in price, and I understood that small businesses operate on tight margins. But then I started paying closer attention and realised the price variations didn't follow any logical pattern. I'd order the exact same thing 3 days in a row and get charged 3 different amounts. Sometimes the register would display one price, but Marcus would tell me a different total. When I'd question the discrepancy, he'd claim the register was glitchy or that he'd accidentally entered the wrong item code, and he'd adjust it to something that seemed reasonable enough that I wouldn't argue. I'm an accountant by profession, so inconsistent numbers bother me more than they probably should. I started keeping detailed records of every purchase at Brewhaven, noting the date, time, what I ordered, what the register displayed, and what Marcus actually charged me. Over the course of 2 months, I documented 43 transactions, and the pattern that emerged was disturbing. Marcus was running what I can only describe as a dynamic pricing scam. He was charging different amounts based on how much attention customers were paying. If you were on your phone, or distracted, or in a hurry, he'd add an extra $1 or $2 to your total. If you were paying with cash and didn't wait for your change, he'd keep it. If you paid with a card and didn't look at the receipt, he'd round up significantly. He was essentially testing each customer to see how much he could get away with stealing. The really insidious part was that he was careful about it. He never overcharged by enough to make someone feel like it was worth causing a confrontation. An extra $1 here, $2 there, maybe $3 if he thought he could get away with it. Most people wouldn't notice or wouldn't care enough to say anything about such small amounts. But across dozens of customers per day, every single day, those small overcharges were adding up to serious money. I started watching his interactions with other customers more carefully, and I could see the pattern clearly once I knew what to look for. Elderly customers who seemed confused about the total got charged more. Young professionals rushing to work got upcharged. Tourists unfamiliar with local prices paid the most. But regular customers, who always paid attention to their receipts and questioned discrepancies, got charged fair prices. Marcus had basically created a 2-tier pricing system where aware customers paid one price and everyone else subsidised them. I did some math based on my observations and estimated that Marcus was probably stealing somewhere between $200 and $400 per day through these small overcharges. Over the course of a year, that could be over $100,000 in essentially stolen money from customers who trusted him. I debated how to handle this situation. I could confront Marcus directly, but that would just make him more careful, and he'd probably deny everything. I could report him to some kind of consumer protection agency, but proving systematic overcharging would be difficult without more evidence. I could simply stop going there, but that would mean Marcus would continue scamming everyone else who walked through his door. That's when I decided to create a public accountability system that would expose Marcus's scam while giving him a chance to correct his behaviour without me having to directly accuse him of theft. I created a simple spreadsheet on Google Sheets and made it publicly viewable. I titled it Brewhaven Price Tracker and set up columns for date, time, item ordered, register, display price, actual price charged, payment method, and whether the customer appeared to be paying attention. I populated the spreadsheet with all 43 transactions I'd personally documented, showing the clear pattern of overcharging. Then I printed out a QR code that linked to the spreadsheet and started leaving small cards with the code around the coffee shop. I'd slip them into the community bulletin board, leave them on tables, and tuck them into the newspaper rack. The cards just said, "Are you being charged the right amount? Track your Brewhaven purchases here," with the QR code below. Within a week, other customers started adding their own transactions to the spreadsheet. The data started flowing in, and the pattern became undeniable. Dozens of people documented the same experience I'd had. Inconsistent pricing, register amounts that didn't match what they were charged, and variations that seemed to correlate with how distracted or rushed they appeared. The spreadsheet started getting shared in neighbourhood Facebook groups and on local Reddit forums. People were comparing their experiences and realising they'd all been experiencing the same thing, but had dismissed it as isolated incidents. Someone created graphs showing the price variations over time. Another person calculated that based on the documented overcharges, Marcus was likely stealing over $150,000 per year. Marcus's business started declining noticeably as word spread. Customers who'd been regulars stopped coming in, or they started very carefully checking their receipts and questioning every charge. I watched him become increasingly nervous and defensive as people pushed back on his pricing. He claimed his register really was malfunctioning and that he'd been meaning to get it fixed. He said he sometimes made honest mistakes when calculating totals in his head. The turning point came when a local news station picked up the story. A consumer protection reporter had seen the spreadsheet and decided to do an undercover investigation. They sent in customers with hidden cameras and documented Marcus charging different amounts for identical orders based on whether the customer seemed to be paying attention. The news segment aired during prime time and showed Marcus's scam in clear, undeniable detail. The backlash was immediate and severe. The city's Consumer Protection Office launched an official investigation. Customers started filing complaints and demanding refunds for overcharges going back months or years. Brewhaven's online reviews filled with people sharing their experiences of being systematically overcharged. Marcus tried to defend himself on social media, claiming he was being targeted by a competitor and that the whole thing was blown out of proportion, but the evidence was overwhelming. Within 3 weeks of the news story airing, Brewhaven closed permanently. Marcus posted a bitter farewell message blaming cancel culture and saying that small business owners were being persecuted for minor mistakes. He never actually admitted to intentionally overcharging customers, maintaining to the end that it was all just register malfunctions and honest errors. The space sat empty for about 2 months before being taken over by new owners who opened a bakery cafe. They made a point of having clearly displayed prices, itemised receipts for every transaction, and prominent signs encouraging customers to verify their charges. The new place is actually better than Brewhaven ever was, with better coffee and genuinely fair pricing. I ran into Marcus a few months after his shop closed. He was working as a barista at the corporate chain down the street, the same place he used to mock for being soulless and uncaring about the community. He pretended not to recognise me, but I could tell he knew exactly who I was. There was something almost satisfying about seeing him in a corporate uniform, working a register that automatically calculated the correct price every time, with no opportunity for creative accounting. The whole experience taught me that small local businesses aren't automatically more ethical than big corporations just because they're small and local. Marcus had taken advantage of the goodwill and trust that comes with being a neighbourhood fixture, and he'd used that trust to systematically steal from the very community that was supporting him. The spreadsheet I created became a tool that empowered customers to hold him accountable without needing lawyers or formal complaints, just transparent data that spoke for itself. That story shows that sometimes the best way to fight dishonesty isn't through confrontation or accusations, but through creating systems of transparency that make dishonest behaviour impossible to hide or maintain. Our next story comes from someone who discovered their neighbour had been secretly using their Wi-Fi for over a year and decided to teach them a lesson about digital freeloading in the most creative way possible. I live in a duplex where the walls are thin enough that I can occasionally hear my neighbour's television through the shared wall, but we've always maintained a polite distance. My neighbour Kevin moved in about 18 months ago, and we'd exchange friendly waves when taking out trash or collecting mail, but we never really had substantial conversations beyond basic pleasantries about weather or parking. About 3 months ago, I started noticing that my internet connection was significantly slower than usual, especially during evenings and weekends. Pages were taking forever to load, streaming videos kept buffering, and my video calls for work were constantly dropping. I assumed my internet service provider was having issues or that I needed to upgrade my equipment, so I didn't think much of it initially. Then I got my monthly internet bill and noticed that my data usage had nearly tripled compared to previous months. I live alone, work from home, and my internet habits hadn't changed at all, so this massive spike in usage made no sense. I started investigating and decided to check my router settings to see if I could identify what was consuming so much bandwidth. That's when I discovered that there were multiple devices connected to my Wi-Fi network that I didn't recognise. 2 laptops, 3 smartphones, a tablet, a gaming console, and what appeared to be 2 smart televisions were all actively using my internet connection. I live alone and own exactly 1 laptop, 1 phone, and 1 television. Someone was definitely piggybacking on my Wi-Fi, and based on the sheer number of devices, they were treating my internet like their personal unlimited data plan. I checked my router logs and discovered that these unauthorized devices had been connecting to my network for over a year. Whoever was using my Wi-Fi had somehow figured out my password shortly after I'd set up my internet service and had been freeloading ever since. The bandwidth usage logs showed massive amounts of data being consumed daily, including large file downloads, constant video streaming, and online gaming that was eating up my connection speed. My first instinct was to simply change my Wi-Fi password and lock them out, but I felt like that was too easy and didn't really teach any kind of lesson. Someone had been stealing from me for over a year, costing me money through increased data charges and degraded service quality, and I wanted them to understand that actions have consequences. I started monitoring the unauthorized devices more carefully to understand usage patterns. The heaviest usage always came from the same cluster of devices, and the timing lined up perfectly with when I could hear television sounds through my shared wall with Kevin's side of the duplex. It became obvious that my neighbour was the Wi-Fi thief, and he'd been using my internet for everything from streaming movies to online gaming to downloading what appeared to be massive files. Instead of confronting Kevin directly or just changing my password, I decided to have some fun with the situation first. I have a background in network administration from my college IT support days, so I had the knowledge to get creative with how I handled this digital freeloader. First, I set up bandwidth throttling specifically for the unauthorized devices. I configured my router to limit their connection speeds to dial-up era levels around 56 kilobits per second. For context, that's the speed internet had back in the late 1990s when people used phone lines to connect. It's technically functional, but absolutely agonizing for anything modern. Web pages would load one element at a time over the course of minutes. Videos would buffer endlessly, and online gaming would be completely impossible. I let that run for a few days and could occasionally hear Kevin through the wall, clearly frustrated with his suddenly terrible internet connection. I heard him on the phone with what sounded like tech support, complaining about his internet being impossibly slow. The irony of him calling to complain about internet that he was stealing from me was absolutely delicious. Next, I set up a captive portal that would redirect all web traffic from the unauthorized devices to custom pages I created. Every website Kevin tried to visit would instead display messages like, "Still using your neighbour's Wi-Fi without permission?" or "Bandwidth theft is bandwidth theft, Kevin," or "Maybe try paying for your own internet service." I made sure the messages were clear enough that he'd understand he'd been caught, but not so aggressive that they felt threatening. The captive portal was particularly effective because it meant Kevin couldn't access anything online without being constantly reminded that he was stealing. Every single web page, every app that required internet connectivity, every attempt to stream or download anything would redirect to one of my custom messages. I rotated through different messages to keep things interesting and to make sure he couldn't just ignore them. I could hear Kevin through the wall, becoming increasingly agitated. There were sounds of furniture moving, and at one point I'm pretty sure he was rebooting his router multiple times, trying to fix what he thought was a problem with his equipment. He had no idea that the issue was my router actively trolling him for being a Wi-Fi thief. After about a week of this, I escalated to the final phase of my plan. I configured the network to allow the unauthorized devices to connect, but to inject random content into his web browsing. Every 10th image on websites would be replaced with pictures of people paying bills or screenshots of internet service provider sign-up pages. Embedded videos would occasionally be swapped with clips about the importance of paying for services you use. Search results would include sponsored links to local internet providers with their introductory pricing deals. The content injection was subtle enough that Kevin might think his devices were infected with adware, but frequent enough to be incredibly annoying. I was essentially turning his stolen internet connection into a constant advertisement for getting his own legitimate service. I also set up scheduled disconnections where the unauthorized devices would be kicked off the network at random intervals, sometimes for just a few minutes, sometimes for hours. The unpredictability meant Kevin could never rely on the connection for anything important. He couldn't schedule video calls, couldn't commit to online gaming sessions with friends, and couldn't stream shows without constant interruptions. After 2 weeks of this digital psychological warfare, I finally decided to end the experiment. I changed my Wi-Fi password to something much more secure and enabled proper network encryption that would make it significantly harder for anyone to crack. All of Kevin's devices were immediately locked out, and my internet speed returned to normal almost instantly. The next day, I saw Kevin outside, and he looked absolutely exhausted. He mentioned casually that he'd been having terrible internet problems and was finally breaking down and calling to set up his own service because his current situation had become unbearable. I played innocent and sympathised with how frustrating technology problems could be, suggesting that having reliable internet was definitely worth paying for. Kevin never admitted to stealing my Wi-Fi, and I never directly confronted him about it. But the knowing look we exchanged made it clear that we both understood exactly what had happened. He'd been caught, thoroughly messed with, and forced to finally pay for his own internet service after over a year of freeloading. My internet bills went back to normal, my connection speeds improved dramatically, and I never had unauthorized devices on my network again. I occasionally still hear Kevin through the wall, but now when his shows buffer or his connection drops, I know it's his own problem with his own service that he's actually paying for. A few months later, I ran into Kevin at the mailbox, and he actually apologised, though he framed it vaguely as being sorry if his devices had ever accidentally connected to my network. I accepted his non-apology apology and suggested that if he ever needed Wi-Fi password recommendations for better security, I'd be happy to share some tips. He declined and quickly changed the subject. That story proves that sometimes the best revenge isn't immediate confrontation, but rather a calculated campaign of inconvenience that makes someone desperately want to stop doing the thing they shouldn't have been doing in the first place. Our next story comes from someone who discovered their book club had been secretly ranking members and using the scores to determine who got invited to special events, and the revenge involved turning their own system against them. I joined a book club about 2 years ago after moving to a new city and wanting to meet people who shared my interest in reading. The group met twice a month at a local library, and it seemed like a perfect way to combine socialising with my favourite hobby. There were about 15 regular members, mostly women in their 30s and 40s, and the group was run by someone named Christine, who'd founded the club 5 years earlier. For the first year, everything seemed normal and welcoming. We'd read a mix of literary fiction, mysteries, and the occasional non-fiction book. Discussions were lively and people seemed genuinely interested in different perspectives. Christine was organised and kept things running smoothly, always preparing discussion questions and moderating conversations to make sure everyone got a chance to participate. But I started noticing that certain members seemed to have access to special events that were never announced to the full group. There would be casual mentions of wine tastings or author meet and greets or special dinners that apparently some book club members had attended together, but these events were never posted in our group chats or mentioned during meetings. When I'd ask about them, I'd get vague responses about how they were last-minute plans or small gatherings that just happened organically. I also noticed that the same core group of about 6 women seemed to be the ones who always attended these mysterious special events, while the rest of us only ever participated in the regular twice-monthly meetings. This inner circle included Christine and 5 others, who all seemed to have been in the book club for years and had developed close friendships that extended beyond just discussing books. The truth came out in the most ridiculous way possible. Christine accidentally added me to a private group chat that I wasn't supposed to be part of. Within seconds of the accidental ad, my phone exploded with messages from this secret chat, and before Christine could remove me, I'd seen enough to understand what was actually happening. The book club had a secret ranking system. Every member was scored on a scale of 1 to 10 based on criteria that included how insightful their comments were, how often they hosted meetings, whether they brought snacks, their social media presence, and even subjective measures like how well they fit the group's aesthetic. This ranking determined everything from seating arrangements at meetings to who got invited to special events to whose book suggestions actually got selected for the reading list. I scrolled through months of messages in this secret chat and discovered that members were being discussed and evaluated like contestants on some kind of reality show. There were debates about whether someone's recent comments had been interesting enough to maintain their ranking. There were discussions about demoting people who'd missed too many meetings or who hadn't contributed enough to group activities. There were even conversations about whether certain members should be quietly pushed out of the club if their scores dropped too low. My own ranking was apparently a 6.5, which Christine and her inner circle considered solidly average. According to their discussions, I was a reliable participant who always read the books and contributed decent insights, but I wasn't interesting or well-connected enough to be invited into the inner circle. They'd noted that I worked in database management, which they found boring, and that my book suggestions tended toward genre fiction rather than the literary works they preferred. The most disturbing discovery was that this ranking system had been in place since the club's founding. Christine had created it as a way to manage the group as it grew, and the inner circle consisted of the original members who'd helped establish the scoring criteria. They genuinely believed this was a reasonable way to run a book club, treating friendship and literary discussion like some kind of meritocracy where people had to earn their way into deeper levels of inclusion. I was furious but also fascinated by the sheer absurdity of the situation. These were adults in their 30s and 40s running a book club like it was an exclusive sorority with pledge requirements and membership tiers. The amount of time and energy they'd invested in ranking and evaluating people who just wanted to discuss books was both impressive and deeply sad. Instead of confronting Christine directly or exposing the ranking system to the full group, I decided to use my actual job skills to completely dismantle their little hierarchy. I work in database management and data analysis, which Christine's inner circle had dismissed as boring, but which gave me exactly the tools I needed to turn their ranking system into their own downfall. I created a detailed analysis of the book club's operations using data I could gather from our public group chat, meeting attendance records, and the glimpse I'd gotten into their private ranking discussions. I built a presentation showing how the secret ranking system had created statistical biases in book selection, how certain types of members were systematically excluded from meaningful participation, and how the club had essentially become an exclusionary social club disguised as an inclusive literary discussion group. But the real genius was that I framed my analysis as a proposal for improving the book club's operations. I presented it at a regular meeting as a data-driven approach to making our group more engaging and equitable. I showed graphs demonstrating that book selections were heavily skewed toward preferences of a small core group. I presented attendance data showing that certain members received far more hosting opportunities than others. I included survey results I'd collected anonymously from members asking about their experiences and whether they felt equally included in all club activities. I never mentioned the ranking system directly or accused anyone of anything. I simply presented objective data that made it impossible to ignore the patterns of exclusion and favouritism that had been built into the club structure. The regular members who'd been stuck at lower rankings without knowing it started asking questions and connecting dots. Why did the same people always get to pick books? Why were some members always hosting while others never got asked? Why did it seem like there were club activities happening that only certain people knew about? Christine and her inner circle tried to deflect and downplay the findings, but I'd made my presentation too data-focused and objective for them to dismiss it as personal complaints or misunderstandings. Other members started sharing their own experiences of feeling excluded or undervalued, and the secret ranking system's existence became an open secret that everyone was suddenly talking about. The breaking point came when one of the inner circle members, apparently feeling defensive, actually admitted that they'd been trying to maintain quality standards and that not everyone was equally suited for all club activities. She said it like this was a reasonable position, apparently not realising how elitist and ridiculous it sounded when stated openly. The book club imploded within 2 weeks. About 10 of the 15 members quit, including me and everyone else who'd been ranked below an 8 in the secret system. Christine tried to apologise and suggested reforming the club with more transparent structures, but the trust was completely destroyed. People were angry about years of being evaluated and judged without their knowledge, about being excluded from events they would have enjoyed, and about being treated like their participation in a casual book club needed to meet someone else's standards. I started a new book club with several of the people who'd quit the original group. We explicitly established that there would be no ranking systems, no inner circles, and no secret special events. Everyone gets equal input on book selections through a simple voting system. Anyone can volunteer to host meetings. All club activities are announced to everyone and open to anyone who wants to attend. Revolutionary concepts, apparently. Our new book club is significantly more fun and inclusive than the old one ever was. We read a wider variety of books because we're not filtering selections through someone's arbitrary standards of literary merit. Discussions are more honest because people aren't worried about being evaluated or ranked based on their contributions. And most importantly, everyone actually wants to be there, instead of constantly wondering if they're good enough to deserve full inclusion. Christine's original book club still exists technically, but it's down to just the core inner circle members reading books together and presumably still ranking each other on whatever criteria they've decided matter. I occasionally see their posts in local community groups trying to recruit new members, always emphasising how welcoming and inclusive they are. I never comment, but I always smile knowing that anyone who joins will eventually discover the truth about what that club really is. That story demonstrates that the moment you start treating human relationships like a competition with winners and losers, you've already lost sight of what made those relationships valuable in the first place. Our next story comes from someone who discovered their upstairs neighbour had been deliberately making noise to force them out of their rent-controlled apartment, and the revenge involved some creative acoustic engineering. I moved into my apartment in Brooklyn 3 years ago and felt incredibly lucky to have found a rent-controlled unit in a building that was otherwise being converted to market-rate luxury apartments. My rent was locked in at $1,200 a month for a one-bedroom in a neighbourhood where similar apartments were going for $3,000 or more. The landlord, a real estate investment company, had been trying to push out the remaining rent-controlled tenants for years so they could renovate and charge premium prices. For the first year, everything was fine. My upstairs neighbour was a quiet, elderly woman named Mrs. Chen, who I'd occasionally see in the hallway. She'd lived in the building for over 30 years and had the same type of rent-controlled lease that protected her from massive rent increases. We'd chat sometimes about the building's history and the changes happening in the neighbourhood, and she seemed like the perfect neighbour. Then Mrs. Chen moved to assisted living, and her apartment sat empty for about 2 months while the landlord renovated it. When the new tenant moved in, my life became immediately and dramatically worse. Starting from day one, there was constant noise from above, heavy footsteps at all hours, furniture being dragged across floors, things being dropped repeatedly, and what sounded like someone doing jumping jacks or aerobics at 2 a.m. I tried to be understanding at first. Moving in is chaotic and people need time to settle. But the noise didn't decrease after a few weeks. If anything, it got worse and more deliberate. The footsteps would pace back and forth directly above my bedroom from midnight until 3 or 4 a.m. Objects would hit the floor in rhythmic patterns that seemed designed to be maximally annoying. The furniture dragging happened multiple times per day, as if my upstairs neighbour was constantly rearranging their entire apartment. I left polite notes and tried knocking on their door several times, but I never got a response. The upstairs apartment seemed occupied because the noise continued, but I never actually saw anyone coming or going. I started wondering if my neighbour was working night shifts, or had some kind of sleep disorder that kept them active at unusual hours. After 3 months of sleep deprivation and constant disturbance, I filed a noise complaint with the building management. That's when things got really interesting. The property manager told me that my upstairs neighbour was actually an employee of the real estate investment company that owned the building. His name was Derek and his job title was property specialist, but his actual role was apparently to make life miserable for rent-controlled tenants until they moved out voluntarily. The property manager let this slip during our conversation, probably not realising how illegal and problematic that information was. She mentioned that Derek had specifically requested the apartment above mine and that his rent was being subsidised by the company. She suggested that perhaps I'd be happier in one of their newly renovated market rate units, which coincidentally had a special promotional rate of only $2,800 per month for valued current tenants. I realised immediately what was happening. The real estate company had deliberately planted a harassment tenant above me to make my rent-controlled apartment unlivable. They were betting that I'd either break my lease and move out, giving them the opportunity to renovate and re-rent at market rates, or that I'd be frustrated enough to accept their offer to relocate to a much more expensive unit. This was clearly illegal harassment designed to push out rent-controlled tenants, but proving it would be difficult and expensive. I could file complaints with city housing authorities, but that process would take months or years and wouldn't stop the immediate noise harassment I was experiencing. I needed a solution that would work quickly and would teach both Derek and the real estate company that they'd picked the wrong tenant to mess with. I work as an audio engineer for a post-production company, which means I understand sound, frequencies and acoustic properties better than most people. I also have access to professional audio equipment and the technical knowledge to use it creatively. I decided to fight noise with noise, but in a much more sophisticated and targeted way than Derek was using against me. I started by recording all of the noise coming from Derek's apartment over the course of 2 weeks. I documented the footsteps, the furniture dragging, the rhythmic dropping of objects, everything. I used professional recording equipment to capture not just the sounds, but their frequencies, patterns and timing. What I discovered was that Derek was following a script. The noise patterns repeated on a predictable schedule, which confirmed that this was deliberate harassment rather than normal living activities. Next, I analysed the acoustic properties of our building structure. Older buildings like ours have specific resonant frequencies where sound travels most efficiently through the structure. I identified the exact frequencies that would transmit most effectively from my apartment up through Derek's floor, and I designed a custom audio system specifically optimised for those frequencies. I installed a powerful subwoofer system mounted directly against my ceiling, positioned at points where Derek's bedroom and living room were located based on the building's floor plan. The subwoofer was connected to a computer running custom software I'd written that could generate and play specific frequencies at precise times. But here's the key detail. I programmed the system to operate at frequencies that were just barely audible to human ears, right at the threshold where you feel sound as much as hear it. The frequencies I chose, around 18 to 20 Hz, are below the range of normal hearing, but can create feelings of unease, anxiety, and discomfort. They can cause subtle vibrations that disrupt sleep and make spaces feel uncomfortable without any obvious source of noise. In audio engineering, we call this the infrasound range, and it's known for creating psychological effects without being obviously identifiable as sound. I programmed the system to activate whenever Derek's scripted harassment noise started. The moment I detected his footsteps or furniture dragging, my system would respond with a precisely calibrated infrasound pulse that would make his apartment subtly uncomfortable. The beauty of this approach was that Derek wouldn't be able to identify what was wrong. He'd just feel increasingly uneasy and disturbed in his own apartment without being able to pinpoint why. I also added a secondary layer to my revenge. I programmed random short bursts of slightly higher frequencies, around 40 to 60 Hz, that would occur at unpredictable intervals throughout the day and night. These frequencies wouldn't be loud enough to constitute a noise violation, but they'd be just noticeable enough to be annoying and disruptive. They'd interrupt sleep, make concentration difficult, and create a constant, low-level stress response. The results were spectacular. Within 3 days of activating my system, Derek's harassment noise decreased noticeably. Within a week, it had almost completely stopped. I could occasionally hear him moving around his apartment at odd hours, clearly uncomfortable and unable to settle. Through my ceiling, I could hear him on phone calls complaining about feeling strange in his apartment and not being able to sleep properly. I kept the system running for about a month, gradually increasing the intensity as Derek seemed to acclimate to lower levels. I varied the timing and frequencies to prevent him from identifying any patterns or figuring out what was causing his discomfort. The psychological impact of unexplainable unease in your own home is profound, and Derek was experiencing exactly what he'd been trying to inflict on me. After 6 weeks of my acoustic counter-harassment, Derek moved out. I later learned from another tenant that he'd complained to the real estate company about the apartment having some kind of structural or environmental problem that was making him sick. He'd requested a transfer to a different building, apparently unable to handle the same kind of treatment he'd been dishing out to me. The apartment above me sat empty for 2 months before the real estate company rented it to an actual tenant, a young professional who works normal hours and makes normal amounts of noise. We've become friendly neighbours, and she's mentioned several times how much she loves the apartment and how peaceful the building is. I never told her about Derek or my acoustic revenge system, which I dismantled as soon as she moved in. The real estate company never attempted to plant another harassment tenant above me. Word apparently spread among their property specialists that the rent-controlled tenant in my unit wasn't someone to mess with. My rent remains locked at $1,200 a month, and I sleep peacefully every night, knowing that I successfully defended my home using nothing but sound waves and a thorough understanding of acoustic engineering. That story proves that when someone tries to use technical tactics against you, having superior technical knowledge and the creativity to apply it can turn their weapons into their own downfall. Our next story comes from someone who discovered their wedding photographer had been secretly downgrading their photos to sell premium editing services, and the revenge involved exposing an entire industry scam. I got married last October in what should have been the perfect full wedding. My husband and I had spent over a year planning every detail, and we'd allocated a significant portion of our budget to photography, because we wanted beautiful professional images to remember the day. We hired a photographer named Vanessa, who came highly recommended and had a stunning portfolio on her website. Her packages were expensive, starting at $4,000 for basic coverage, but everyone said she was worth every penny. Vanessa was wonderful on the wedding day. She was professional, creative, and seemed to capture every important moment. She had an assistant with her who handled lighting and equipment, and they both worked seamlessly throughout the ceremony and reception. When we said goodbye at the end of the night, Vanessa promised we'd have our edited photos within 6 weeks, which seemed like a reasonable timeline. 6 weeks later, we received a link to our wedding gallery. I was so excited to finally see our professional photos that I immediately sat down with my laptop and started going through them. What I saw was deeply disappointing. The photos were technically competent, but they looked flat, underexposed, and weirdly dull compared to the vibrant images in Vanessa's portfolio. Colours seemed muted, lighting seemed off, and many shots that should have been beautiful just looked mediocre. I initially assumed maybe the venue lighting had been challenging, or that our wedding just hadn't been as photogenic as we'd hoped, but then I received an email from Vanessa offering her premium editing package. For an additional $1,500, she could apply advanced colour correction, professional retouching, and artistic enhancement to transform our photos into the kind of stunning images shown in her portfolio. She included before and after examples using photos from our wedding, and the difference was dramatic. The premium edited versions looked exactly like the portfolio images that had convinced us to hire her in the first place. Vibrant colours, perfect lighting, beautiful composition, everything we'd expected to receive as part of our original package. The implication was clear. The photos we'd received were deliberately inferior versions, and we'd need to pay significantly more to get what we thought we'd already purchased. I was furious but also confused. I'd assumed that professional wedding photography included professional editing as a standard part of the service. I started researching and discovered that several other photographers in our area were using the same tactic. They'd deliver mediocre edited photos and then upsell premium editing services, essentially holding the good versions of your wedding photos hostage unless you paid extra. What made this particularly frustrating was that Vanessa's portfolio and marketing materials showed only the premium edited versions of her work. Every review site, every social media post, every sample image was the enhanced version that required additional payment. She was advertising a product she wasn't actually delivering unless clients paid hundreds or thousands more than the initial package price. I have a background in graphic design and photo editing, so I decided to investigate exactly what Vanessa had done to our photos. I downloaded the original files she'd provided and started analysing them in professional editing software. What I discovered was shocking. The photos hadn't been underexposed or poorly lit during capture. Vanessa had deliberately degraded them during the editing process. The metadata in the image files revealed that she'd applied filters and adjustments that reduced colour saturation, decreased contrast, and added a slight muddy tone to what had originally been perfectly good photos. She'd essentially taken professional quality images and made them worse on purpose, then offered to fix the problems she'd created for an additional fee. It was like a mechanic loosening your brake lines and then offering to fix your brake problems for extra money. I started reaching out to other people who'd used Vanessa's services, finding them through wedding planning forums and photographer review sites. Out of 15 former clients I contacted, 12 had been offered the same premium editing upsell. Most had paid the additional fee because they desperately wanted good photos from their weddings and felt trapped by the situation. A few had declined and were still disappointed with their wedding photos years later. One bride I spoke with had actually hired a different photographer to re-edit Vanessa's original raw files, and those versions looked dramatically better than what Vanessa had delivered. This confirmed that the problem wasn't the photography itself, but the deliberate degradation of the edited versions. I decided to expose Vanessa's scam in a way that would warn future couples and potentially force her to change her deceptive business practices. I created a detailed blog post documenting everything I'd discovered. I included side-by-side comparisons of the degraded photos Vanessa delivered versus properly edited versions. I created myself from the same files. I showed the metadata proving the images had been deliberately altered to look worse. I included testimonials from other couples who'd experienced the same upselling tactic. But the key element was that I reached out to every wedding venue, bridal shop, and wedding planning service in our area that had Vanessa listed as a recommended vendor. I sent them my documentation and explained that she was using deceptive practices to extract additional money from couples who'd already paid premium prices for her services. I suggested they might want to reconsider recommending someone who was essentially running a bait and switch operation. The response was immediate and significant. Within 2 weeks, Vanessa had been removed from the preferred vendor lists of 8 major wedding venues and 3 popular wedding planning websites. Several venues posted statements saying they were committed to recommending only vendors who operated with transparency and integrity. Vanessa tried to defend herself on social media, claiming that premium editing was a luxury service and that her standard package had always included only basic editing. But I'd saved screenshots of her original marketing materials and contract language, which had promised professional editing and enhancement without any mention of different editing tiers. Her own promotional materials contradicted her defense. Other photographers in the area started distancing themselves from Vanessa and her practices. Several posted statements clarifying their own editing policies and emphasizing that all photos delivered to clients received the same level of professional editing shown in their portfolios. The photography community seemed collectively embarrassed that one of their members had been operating this way. The local wedding planning community completely turned against Vanessa. Brides started sharing their experiences in Facebook groups and on wedding planning forums. Review sites were flooded with honest accounts of the upselling tactics and deliberately degraded photos. Her business reputation was essentially destroyed within a month. Vanessa eventually offered to re-edit our wedding photos at no additional charge and provide the premium versions as an apology. I declined and told her I'd already properly edited the images myself. I didn't want anything more from someone who tried to scam us on one of the most important days of our lives. What happened next was even more interesting. Several other photographers who'd been using similar tactics quietly changed their business practices. Package descriptions became more transparent about what editing was included. Portfolio images started including disclaimers about editing levels. The industry in our area seemed to collectively decide that this kind of deceptive upselling wasn't worth the reputational risk. Vanessa closed her photography business about 4 months after my blog post went public. She claimed she was pursuing other opportunities, but everyone in the wedding industry knew she'd been forced out by her own unethical practices. The last I heard, she'd moved to a different state and was trying to restart her photography career under a different business name. My wedding photos ended up being beautiful once I properly edited them myself. I learned professional photo editing techniques specifically to fix what Vanessa had deliberately broken, and the final results were everything we'd hoped for when we first hired her. Several other couples I'd connected with during my investigation also learned to edit their own photos or hired ethical photographers to re-edit their images. The experience taught me that expensive doesn't always mean ethical, and that sometimes the people you trust with your most important memories are willing to hold those memories hostage for additional profit. It also taught me that exposing unethical practices publicly can create change, not just for yourself, but for an entire community of potential future victims. That story shows that when someone tries to take advantage of your emotional investment in something irreplaceable, like wedding memories, the best revenge is exposing their tactics so thoroughly that they can never use them again. Random Reddit story about love. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that sometimes the most profound love stories don't follow the script we expect them to. I never believed in soulmates until I met Sarah at the worst possible moment in both our lives. We were sitting in adjacent chairs in a hospital waiting room at 3 a.m, both of us exhausted and terrified for completely different reasons. I was there because my father had just had a massive heart attack, and the doctors weren't sure if he'd make it through the night. Sarah was there because her younger sister had been in a severe car accident and was in emergency surgery. We didn't speak at first, just two strangers drowning in our own private oceans of worry and fear. The thing about hospital waiting rooms at 3 a.m. is that they strip away all the normal social barriers people maintain. There's something about fluorescent lights, terrible coffee, and the smell of antiseptic that makes strangers into temporary companions in suffering. Sarah started crying first, these quiet tears that she kept trying to wipe away discreetly, and I found myself offering her the travel pack of tissues I'd been clutching since I arrived. She took them with a grateful nod, and we sat in silence for another 20 minutes before she finally spoke. She told me about her sister, Emily, who was 22 years old and had been driving home from her nursing school night shift when a drunk driver ran a red light. Sarah's voice broke as she described how Emily had always been the responsible one, the family member everyone counted on to make good decisions and stay safe. The randomness of the accident, the unfairness of it happening to someone who'd done everything right, was tearing Sarah apart in real time. I listened because I didn't know what else to do, and because focusing on her pain was easier than confronting my own. When she finished, I told her about my dad, about how he'd been my hero growing up, teaching me to throw a baseball and change a tire and treat people with respect regardless of their circumstances. I told her about how he'd worked 2 jobs to put me through college and how he'd never complained once about the sacrifices he made for our family. I explained that the heart attack had come out of nowhere, striking him down while he was doing yard work on a beautiful Saturday afternoon, and how I kept thinking about all the conversations we'd never finished and all the times I'd been too busy to visit. Sarah reached over and squeezed my hand, and we sat like that for a while, 2 people holding on to each other because we were both afraid of drowning. The hours crawled by in that waiting room, and we talked about everything and nothing. We discussed our favourite movies and our worst first dates, and the dreams we'd had as children that hadn't quite worked out the way we'd planned. Sarah told me about her job as a high school art teacher and how she'd always wanted to open her own gallery someday. I told her about my work as an environmental engineer and how I'd originally wanted to be a marine biologist until I realised I got seasick on boats. We laughed at inappropriate moments because sometimes laughter is the only defence against overwhelming sadness, and we cried together when the fear became too heavy to carry alone. Around 5 a.m, a doctor came out to talk to Sarah. Her sister had made it through surgery and was stable, though she'd need extensive rehabilitation for her injuries. Sarah collapsed in relief, and I held her while she sobbed into my shoulder, feeling her terror transform into grateful exhaustion. An hour later, my own doctor appeared with news that my father had stabilised and the immediate danger had passed. We'd both received our small miracles in the span of 60 minutes, and suddenly the waiting room that had felt like purgatory became a place where hope was possible again. We exchanged phone numbers before leaving the hospital, both of us acknowledging that something significant had happened between us in those dark hours. I told myself it was just the intensity of the situation creating a false sense of connection, that we'd probably never actually use those numbers. But 3 days later, I found myself texting Sarah to ask how Emily was recovering, and she responded within minutes with a detailed update and a question about my father's progress. Our text conversation continued for hours, and by the end of the week, we'd agreed to meet for coffee at a cafe halfway between our respective homes. That first real date was awkward in the best possible way. We'd already shared our deepest fears and vulnerabilities in the hospital waiting room, so small talk felt ridiculous and pointless. Instead, we dove straight into the kind of conversations people usually don't have until they've known each other for months. Sarah told me about her failed engagement 3 years earlier, and how she'd spent the time since then focusing on her career and her family rather than dating. I shared my own history of relationships that had fizzled out because I'd never felt that spark of real connection with anyone. We both admitted that we were terrified of getting hurt again, but that something about meeting in that hospital waiting room felt like the universe giving us a chance we'd be foolish to ignore. Our relationship developed in reverse of how most love stories unfold. We'd already seen each other at our most vulnerable and broken, so building from that foundation felt solid in a way my previous relationships never had. Sarah understood my complicated feelings about my father's mortality because she'd been sitting next to me when I first confronted them. I understood her protective instincts toward Emily because I'd witnessed the depth of her love and fear in real time. We didn't have to explain ourselves to each other because we'd already been introduced to the core of who we really were beneath all the social masks people usually wear. My father recovered slowly but steadily, and Emily eventually regained most of her mobility through months of difficult physical therapy. Sarah and I supported each other through all of it, taking turns being the strong one when the other person needed to fall apart. We celebrated small victories together and grieved small setbacks as a team. Somewhere in the middle of all that shared experience, we fell completely and irreversibly in love with each other. We got married 2 years after that night in the hospital waiting room, and both my father and Emily were healthy enough to attend. During the reception, my dad pulled me aside and told me that sometimes the worst moments of our lives crack us open in ways that allow the right people to finally reach our hearts. He said that if he hadn't had that heart attack, I might never have met the woman who was clearly my perfect match, and that he'd gladly go through it all again if it meant I'd found this kind of happiness. Sarah and I still visit that hospital occasionally, not because we need medical care, but because we like to sit in that waiting room for a few minutes and remember where our story began. People probably think we're crazy, choosing to spend time in a place associated with trauma and fear, but for us, it's sacred ground. That waiting room is where two broken people found each other in the darkness and decided to help each other find the light. That story shows us that love doesn't always arrive in perfect circumstances with romantic lighting and carefully planned moments. Sometimes it finds us in hospital waiting rooms at 3 a.m. when we're too exhausted and scared to maintain our defences, and those unplanned, imperfect beginnings can become the foundation for something more real and lasting than any fairy tale romance. Random Reddit story about work. Our next story comes from someone who learned that standing up for yourself at work sometimes means watching your terrible boss dig their own grave in the most spectacular way possible. I worked as a graphic designer at a mid-sized marketing agency where my boss Dennis had perfected the art of taking credit for other people's work while contributing absolutely nothing of value himself. Dennis had been with the company for 15 years and had somehow convinced upper management that he was an irreplaceable creative genius, when in reality he couldn't design a decent business card if his life depended on it. He'd built his entire career on stealing ideas from the talented people he supervised and presenting them as his own brilliant concepts to clients and executives. The system Dennis had developed was actually pretty sophisticated in its awfulness. He'd assign projects to designers on his team, then schedule individual review meetings where he'd ask us to walk him through our creative process and explain our design choices in excruciating detail. He'd take notes during these meetings, asking questions that seemed thoughtful and engaged, making us feel like he was genuinely interested in understanding our work. Then he'd schedule presentations with clients or executives where he'd present our exact designs as his own creations, using the explanations and rationale we'd provided in our review meetings as if he'd thought of everything himself. What made it particularly infuriating was how good Dennis was at performing the role of creative director during these presentations. He'd talk passionately about design principles and brand strategy, using all the terminology and insights his team had shared with him in private. Clients loved him because he seemed so knowledgeable and invested in their projects. Executives praised him for his innovative thinking and creative vision. Meanwhile, the actual designers who'd done all the work sat in the background, watching someone else receive recognition for hundreds of hours of our labour and creativity. I'd been tolerating this situation for about 18 months, telling myself that at least I was building my portfolio and gaining experience, even if I wasn't getting proper credit. But the breaking point came when Dennis stole credit for a campaign I'd developed for our agency's biggest client, a regional bank chain that was rebranding their entire visual identity. I'd spent 3 months on this project, working evenings and weekends to create something truly special. The campaign included a complete visual system with logos, colour palettes, typography guidelines, marketing materials, and even animated content for their digital platforms. Dennis did his usual routine, having me explain every element of the campaign in our private review meeting, taking detailed notes while praising my thorough approach. Then he presented the entire thing to the client and our executive team as his own creative vision, describing his inspiration and his design process using my exact words and ideas. The client was so impressed they signed a 2-year contract extension worth over $500,000. Dennis received a massive bonus, a promotion to senior creative director, and was featured in a local business magazine article about innovative marketing leadership. I received a generic email from Human Resources thanking me for my contributions to a successful quarter. That was it. 3 months of my life, my creativity, my late nights, and sacrificed weekends, all reduced to a form letter acknowledgement while Dennis got promoted and celebrated. I was furious, but I was also strategic enough to know that complaining would make me look petty and jealous while accomplishing nothing. Dennis had been playing this game for 15 years and he knew how to deflect any accusations or concerns about his methods. That's when I decided to give Dennis exactly what he'd been asking for all along, but with a twist he'd never see coming. I started working on a pitch for a potential new client, a craft brewery that was looking for an agency to handle their regional expansion campaign. This was exactly the kind of hip, creative project that Dennis loved to claim credit for because it made him look edgy and culturally relevant. I spent 2 weeks developing what appeared to be a brilliant campaign concept, complete with gorgeous mock-ups, clever taglines, and a comprehensive social media strategy. The campaign looked absolutely perfect on the surface, professional and polished, and exactly the kind of work that wins advertising awards. But I'd built fundamental flaws into every aspect of the strategy, problems that would only become obvious to someone who actually understood the client's business and target market. The taglines I'd created used brewing terminology incorrectly in ways that would make actual beer enthusiasts cringe. The visual identity I'd designed violated trademark similarities with 3 major national beer brands, creating potential legal issues. The social media strategy I'd outlined targeted completely wrong demographics for craft beer consumers and suggested posting schedules that made no sense for the industry. Most critically, I'd proposed a partnership campaign with a national restaurant chain that the brewery had explicitly and publicly refused to work with due to a previous bad business relationship. Anyone who'd done even basic research on the client would know this partnership idea was a complete non-starter, but someone just looking at pretty designs and clever copy might miss that detail entirely. I scheduled my review meeting with Dennis and walked him through the campaign exactly like I always did, explaining my creative choices and strategic thinking. I made everything sound brilliant and well-researched using confident language and industry terminology that Dennis would recognise but not fully understand. He loved it immediately, praising my work and saying this was exactly the kind of innovative thinking that would win the brewery's business. He took his usual detailed notes and scheduled a pitch meeting with the potential client for the following week. The pitch meeting was scheduled for 10 in the morning on a Thursday, and I made sure to call in sick that day with a convenient stomach bug. Dennis would have to present the campaign entirely on his own without me there to provide backup or answer technical questions. I'd never missed a client pitch before, so Dennis couldn't accuse me of deliberately sabotaging him, and my sudden illness meant he had no time to fully prepare or understand the work he was about to present as his own. I heard about the meeting from 3 different co-workers who'd witnessed the disaster firsthand. Dennis had started strong, presenting the visual designs with his usual confidence and enthusiasm. The brewery's marketing team seemed engaged initially, nodding along as Dennis described the creative vision using the notes he'd taken from our review meeting. Then they started asking questions, and everything fell apart spectacularly. When Dennis tried to explain the brewing terminology and the taglines, he revealed that he had no idea what the words actually meant or why they didn't make sense in the context he was using them. When the marketing team pointed out the trademark similarities with national brands, Dennis had no explanation for why such obvious legal issues hadn't been caught during the research phase. And when he enthusiastically pitched the restaurant partnership as the centerpiece of the campaign, the brewery's owner actually laughed and asked if Dennis had done any research at all, because that particular restaurant chain was basically their business nemesis. The meeting ended with the brewery declining to work with our agency, specifically citing concerns about our creative director's apparent lack of industry knowledge and basic research skills. They said they needed a partner who understood their business and their brand, not someone who just made things look pretty without understanding what any of it meant. The owner apparently told Dennis directly that the campaign looked like it had been designed by someone who'd never actually tried craft beer or understood anything about brewing culture. Dennis tried to blame me for providing him with flawed work, but that strategy backfired immediately when executives asked why he'd approved and presented a campaign with such obvious problems if he'd actually reviewed it properly. If the work was bad, why had he claimed it was brilliant during the pitch? And if he hadn't noticed the problems before presenting to the client, what exactly was he contributing as creative director? The investigation that followed revealed Dennis's entire system of taking credit for other people's work. Multiple designers came forward with their own stories once they realized management was finally paying attention. People showed emails, project files, and documented instances where Dennis had presented their work as his own, while contributing nothing to the actual creative process. Dennis was demoted within 2 weeks and transferred to a non-management role, where he'd be responsible for producing his own work rather than supervising others. When it became clear he couldn't actually do the job without stealing from talented people around him, he was quietly encouraged to resign. He left the company 3 months after the disastrous brewery pitch, his reputation completely destroyed. I was promoted to creative director shortly after Dennis left, and one of my first actions was implementing a new system where designers presented their own work directly to clients, rather than having it filtered through management. The change improved both morale and client relationships almost immediately, and several team members told me they'd been considering leaving until Dennis was finally removed. The brewery that had rejected our initial pitch reached out 6 months later, asking if we'd be interested in working with them under new leadership. I personally developed their campaign this time, doing actual research and creating work that understood their brand and audience. They've been our client for 3 years now, and the owner still occasionally mentions how glad he is that we got rid of that creative director who didn't know anything about beer. That story proves that sometimes the best way to expose a fraud is to give them exactly what they've been stealing and let them demonstrate that they never understood any of it in the first place. Because competence can't be faked when you're actually required to explain your own supposed brilliance. Random Reddit story. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that their seemingly perfect neighbour had been running an elaborate scam that affected the entire community and decided to take them down using nothing but patience and public records. I lived in a quiet suburban neighbourhood where everyone knew each other and most people had been there for years. We had regular block parties, a neighbourhood watch programme, and one of those community Facebook groups where people posted about lost cats and recommendations for plumbers. It was the kind of place where you'd think nothing dramatic ever happened, which made discovering what my neighbour Jennifer was doing even more shocking. Jennifer had moved into the house next to mine about 3 years ago, and she quickly became the neighbourhood's favourite person. She was always organising charity drives, volunteering to help elderly neighbours with yard work, and hosting fundraisers for various causes. She seemed genuinely kind and generous, the type of person who'd shovel your driveway during a snowstorm without being asked or drop off homemade soup when she heard you were sick. Everyone loved Jennifer and considered her the heart of our community. The first hint that something was wrong came when I overheard Jennifer talking on her phone in her backyard. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but our yards shared a fence and I was outside gardening when her conversation drifted over. She was discussing donation amounts and donor names in a way that seemed odd, talking about how much money certain neighbours had given and making comments about who she could probably convince to contribute more to her next fundraiser. The tone was calculating rather than grateful, more like she was assessing financial targets than appreciating people's generosity. I dismissed it initially as just unfortunate phrasing, but I started paying more attention to Jennifer's various charitable activities. She was constantly running fundraisers for different causes, always with compelling stories about sick children, struggling families, or animals in need. She'd go door to door with heartbreaking photos and detailed explanations of where the money would go. People gave generously because Jennifer made them feel like they were making a real difference, and because she'd built such strong trust in the community through her other helpful activities. What made me truly suspicious was when I noticed that Jennifer never provided any follow-up information about the causes she fundraised for. She'd collect thousands of dollars for a specific sick child or family in crisis, but then there would never be any updates about how the money had helped or what the outcome had been. When people asked, Jennifer would give vague responses about respecting the privacy of the families involved, or explain that she'd moved on to focusing on new urgent needs. I decided to do some digging, starting with the most recent fundraiser Jennifer had organised. She collected over $4,000 from neighbours for a family whose house had supposedly burned down, leaving them homeless with 3 young children. Jennifer had shown photos of the devastated property and shared heartbreaking details about the children losing all their belongings, including their Christmas presents. The neighbourhood had responded with incredible generosity, and Jennifer had collected cash and cheques over the course of 2 weeks. I searched local news archives and fire department records for any house fires matching the timeline and details Jennifer had described. Nothing came up. I expanded my search to surrounding counties and still found no matching incidents. The family Jennifer had described, complete with specific names and ages of the children, didn't appear in any public records I could access. I started to suspect that the entire story had been fabricated. I went back through my own records and memories of Jennifer's previous fundraisers, making a list of every cause she'd championed over the past 3 years. Then I spent weeks researching each one, checking news articles, hospital records, animal shelter reports, and any other public information I could find. What I discovered was chilling. Not a single one of Jennifer's fundraising causes could be verified through independent sources. The sick children didn't exist in hospital records. The struggling families had no presence in any social services databases. And the animal rescue organisations she claimed to work with had never heard of her. Jennifer had been running an elaborate charity scam for years, inventing compelling stories and collecting money from trusting neighbours who believed they were helping people in crisis. She'd probably stolen over $50,000 from our community alone, and there was no telling how many other neighbourhoods she might have targeted before moving to ours. But I knew that simply accusing Jennifer wouldn't work. She was beloved in the community and had spent 3 years building credibility through her other helpful activities. If I made accusations without overwhelming proof, people would likely defend her and dismiss me as someone causing drama or being jealous of her popularity. I needed to expose Jennifer in a way that made denial impossible and showed the entire neighbourhood exactly what she'd been doing. I started by creating a detailed spreadsheet documenting every fundraiser Jennifer had organised since moving to the neighbourhood. For each one, I listed the stated cause, the amount of money collected based on what people remembered contributing, and the supposed outcome. Then I added columns showing my research results, specifically the lack of any verifiable evidence that any of these causes actually existed. Next, I filed public records requests with the county for any registered charitable organisations or fundraising activities associated with Jennifer's name. The results confirmed what I'd suspected. Jennifer had never registered any charitable organisation, never filed any required paperwork for fundraising activities, and had no official connection to any legitimate charities. She'd been operating completely outside any regulatory oversight, which meant the money she collected was going directly into her pocket, with no accountability whatsoever. But I still needed to expose Jennifer in a way that would make the truth undeniable to everyone in the neighbourhood. I decided to use the community Facebook group, the same platform Jennifer had used to promote many of her fundraisers, to reveal what I'd discovered. I spent days crafting a detailed post that laid out all my research methodically and objectively, presenting facts rather than accusations and letting the evidence speak for itself. The post I created was long but carefully organised. I started by expressing appreciation for our community's generous spirit and willingness to help those in need. Then I explained that I'd been researching charitable giving best practices and had decided to look into the outcomes of fundraisers we'd supported as a neighbourhood. I presented my findings for each of Jennifer's fundraisers, showing the original story she'd told, alongside the complete absence of any verifiable information about the supposed beneficiaries. I included screenshots of my public records requests showing no registered charitable activities in Jennifer's name. I provided links to news archive searches showing no matching incidents for the disasters and crises she'd described. I even included information about legal requirements for charitable fundraising and how Jennifer's activities didn't comply with any of them. The post concluded with a suggestion that the neighbourhood might want to ask Jennifer for detailed accounting of where all the donated money had actually gone. I published the post late on a Sunday evening, when I knew most people would be online and browsing social media. The response was immediate and explosive. Within an hour, over 30 neighbours had commented, expressing shock, disbelief, and demands for Jennifer to explain herself. People started sharing their own experiences and comparing notes about the various fundraisers they'd contributed to over the years. The comments section became a collective realisation that an entire community had been systematically deceived. Jennifer tried to respond initially, posting defensive comments about how disappointed she was that someone would question her charitable work and accusing me of trying to destroy her reputation out of jealousy. But every explanation she attempted fell apart under questioning. When people asked for specific information about the families she'd supposedly helped, She couldn't provide verifiable details. When someone demanded receipts or documentation showing where the money had gone, she claimed that privacy concerns prevented her from sharing that information. The neighbourhood turned against Jennifer rapidly once people realised they'd been scammed. Several neighbours filed police reports for fraud, and the collective documentation of her activities made building a case relatively straightforward. The investigation revealed that Jennifer had been running similar scams in 3 other communities before moving to ours, always using the same pattern of building trust through helpful activities before launching fraudulent fundraisers. Jennifer was arrested 6 weeks after my Facebook post and eventually pleaded guilty to multiple counts of charitable fraud. She was sentenced to 3 years in prison and ordered to pay restitution to everyone she'd stolen from, though most of the money was already spent and unlikely to ever be recovered. Her house was sold to help pay the restitution, and she moved away immediately after her release. The experience changed how our neighbourhood approached charitable giving. People became more careful about verifying causes before donating, started asking for documentation and receipts, and learned to recognise red flags in fundraising requests. Several neighbours told me they appreciated that I'd taken the time to research and expose the fraud, rather than just suspecting something was wrong and staying silent. The whole situation taught me that the most dangerous scammers aren't the obvious criminals, but the ones who invest time in building trust and credibility before exploiting it. Jennifer had spent years establishing herself as a caring, generous neighbour, specifically so she could steal from people who trusted her. She'd weaponized the community's kindness and generosity, turning our best qualities against us for personal profit. That story reminds us that sometimes the people who seem most trustworthy are running the longest cons, and that protecting a community sometimes means being willing to ask uncomfortable questions and follow the evidence even when it points towards someone everyone wants to believe in. Random Reddit story. Our next story comes from someone who learned that their roommate's obsessive cleaning habits were actually covering up something far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. I moved in with my roommate Marcus after finding his listing on a roommate matching website. He seemed perfect on paper, a graduate student working on his PhD in chemistry who kept to himself and valued a quiet living environment. The rent was reasonable, the apartment was in a great location near campus, and Marcus came across as responsible and mature during our initial meeting. I thought I'd lucked into the ideal roommate situation. The first month living with Marcus was completely normal. He was quiet and polite, always cleaned up after himself in shared spaces, and we developed a friendly, but not overly close dynamic that worked well for both of us. He spent most of his time either at the university lab or locked in his bedroom working on his research. I was busy with my own job and social life, so having a roommate who valued privacy and independence seemed like a perfect arrangement. The cleaning obsession started gradually in the second month. Marcus began wiping down the kitchen counters multiple times a day, even when they weren't visibly dirty. He'd clean the bathroom sink immediately after anyone used it, and he started keeping cleaning supplies in every room of the apartment. At first I thought he was just particular about cleanliness, maybe a bit of a germaphobe, which seemed reasonable enough for someone working in a laboratory environment where contamination was a constant concern. But Marcus's cleaning behaviour quickly escalated beyond normal tidiness into something that felt compulsive and strange. He'd get up in the middle of the night to clean the kitchen, and I'd wake up at 3 a.m. to the sound of him scrubbing countertops that had already been cleaned hours earlier. He started wearing gloves constantly around the apartment, even when he wasn't actively cleaning anything. He'd wipe down doorknobs and light switches dozens of times a day, always using the same methodical circular motion that seemed almost ritualistic. What really concerned me was when Marcus started cleaning my belongings without permission. I'd come home to find my laptop had been wiped down, my coffee mug had been scrubbed and relocated, and even my coat had been dry cleaned and hung back in the closet without me asking. When I mentioned that I appreciated the gesture, but preferred to handle my own things, Marcus got visibly anxious and explained that he'd noticed some contamination and wanted to make sure everything was safe. He couldn't or wouldn't explain what kind of contamination he meant. The situation took a darker turn when I noticed Marcus was spending excessive amounts of time cleaning the area around the apartment's air vents. He'd stand on a chair and wipe the vent covers obsessively, sometimes for an hour at a time, always wearing gloves and occasionally a dust mask. When I asked what he was doing, he'd give vague explanations about air quality and particulate matter, using technical chemistry terms that sounded authoritative but didn't really answer the question. I started paying closer attention to Marcus's behaviour and noticed other odd patterns. He never let me into his bedroom, always meeting me in the doorway if I knocked and closing the door firmly behind him when he emerged. He received frequent deliveries of packages that he'd rush to bring inside before I could see what they contained. And most concerning, he'd started asking strange questions about my daily schedule, wanting to know exactly when I'd be home or away from the apartment. My growing unease reached a breaking point when I came home early from work one day due to a cancelled meeting. I walked into the apartment to find Marcus in the living room, wearing a full hazmat suit, the kind you'd see in movies about biohazard containment. He was using some kind of electronic device to scan the walls and ceiling, and when he saw me, he looked absolutely panicked. He quickly tried to explain that he was conducting an environmental safety test for a class project, but his explanation made no sense, and the fear in his eyes told me he was lying. That night, after Marcus had gone to his lab, I did something I'm not proud of, but felt was necessary for my own safety. I picked the lock on his bedroom door using a tutorial I found online. What I discovered inside his room made my blood run cold and explained everything about his obsessive cleaning behaviour in the most horrifying way possible. Marcus's bedroom looked like a makeshift chemistry laboratory. He had equipment set up on every surface, including beakers, burners, tubes, and containers filled with various chemicals and substances I couldn't identify. The walls were covered with complex chemical formulas and diagrams that meant nothing to me, but clearly represented serious scientific work. Most disturbing was a detailed map of our apartment's ventilation system, with notes about airflow patterns and distribution rates. I took photos of everything with my shaking hands, trying to document what I was seeing while my mind raced through possibilities of what Marcus might be doing. The cleaning obsession suddenly made terrifying sense. He wasn't worried about contamination from outside sources. He was trying to eliminate evidence of whatever he was producing or testing in his makeshift lab. I carefully locked his door and left the apartment immediately, going straight to a coffee shop where I could think clearly about what to do next. I couldn't go to the police with just photos of chemistry equipment, especially since Marcus was a legitimate chemistry PhD student who might have reasonable explanations for having lab materials at home. But I also couldn't ignore what I'd seen or continue living in an apartment where my roommate was clearly conducting unauthorized experiments. I decided to contact the university's chemistry department chair and explain the situation. I sent the photos along with a detailed description of Marcus's behaviour, emphasising the unauthorised lab setup and my concerns about safety protocols being violated in a residential building. The department chair responded within hours, expressing serious concern and promising to investigate immediately. The investigation moved quickly once the university got involved. It turned out Marcus had been stealing equipment and chemicals from the university lab over the course of several months, smuggling out materials in his backpack and building an unauthorised research setup in our apartment. He'd been conducting experiments that were explicitly forbidden in residential areas due to safety risks, including working with volatile compounds that could have caused explosions or released toxic fumes into our building's ventilation system. The obsessive cleaning had been Marcus's attempt to eliminate any trace evidence of his unauthorised experiments. He'd been terrified that contamination on surfaces or in the air would be detected if building maintenance ever inspected our apartment, or if neighbours complained about strange smells. His paranoia about cleanliness was actually paranoia about getting caught conducting dangerous chemistry in a space where dozens of people lived. Marcus was immediately expelled from the PhD program and faced criminal charges for theft of university property, reckless endangerment, and several violations of hazardous materials regulations. The building management had to conduct extensive safety testing to ensure no dangerous contamination remained in our apartment or the ventilation system. I was allowed to break my lease without penalty and moved out within a week. The most disturbing revelation came during the investigation when experts analysed what Marcus had actually been working on. He'd been trying to synthesise a novel compound for his research, convinced that if he could perfect it outside the constraints of university oversight, he'd be able to publish groundbreaking results that would guarantee his academic career. His ambition had completely overridden his judgment about safety and legality, and he'd put an entire building of people at risk for his personal goals. I still think about how close I came to serious harm living in that apartment. If Marcus had made a mistake with one of his experiments, if something had exploded or released toxic gas, people could have died, and he'd hidden it all behind a facade of being a quiet, responsible roommate who just happened to be very clean. The experience completely changed how I approach living with roommates. I now do extensive background checks. I trust my instincts when something feels off, and I never ignore warning signs just because they seem too strange to be real. Marcus had seemed like the perfect roommate precisely because he was hiding something terrible, and his obsessive cleaning had been the only visible symptom of a much more dangerous secret. That story teaches us that sometimes the behaviours we dismiss as harmless quirks are actually red flags pointing towards something seriously wrong, and that trusting our instincts about people we live with isn't paranoia, but necessary self-protection in a world where danger can hide behind the most mundane facades. Random Reddit story about a neighbour. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that their elderly neighbour's daily routine was actually an elaborate cover for the most wholesome secret imaginable. I moved into my apartment building 2 years ago and immediately noticed my neighbour across the hall, an elderly woman named Mrs. Chen, who seemed to follow the most rigid and peculiar schedule I'd ever witnessed. Every single day, without fail, she'd leave her apartment at exactly 7 in the morning, carrying a large canvas tote bag, return at 9:30, leave again at noon with a different bag, return at 2, and then make a final trip out at 5 in the evening before coming home at 7:30. This pattern never varied, not even on weekends or holidays, and her commitment to this mysterious routine fascinated and puzzled me in equal measure. Mrs. Chen was friendly, but private whenever we crossed paths in the hallway. She'd smile and nod politely, occasionally comment on the weather, but never engaged in real conversation or offered any information about herself or her activities. She lived alone as far as I could tell, rarely had visitors, and her apartment was always quiet except for the sound of her television, playing old movies at a moderate volume in the evenings. What made her routine even more intriguing was the variety of items I'd occasionally glimpse in her bags. Sometimes I'd see what looked like craft supplies, other times grocery bags filled with ingredients, and occasionally she'd be carrying stacks of books or bundles of fabric. The contents seemed random and unrelated, making it impossible to guess what she was doing during her 3 daily excursions that required such different materials. My curiosity turned into concern when I noticed Mrs. Chen was looking increasingly tired and frail. She'd always been thin, but she seemed to be losing weight and moving more slowly. Dark circles appeared under her eyes, and she started using a cane for her walks, even though she hadn't needed one when I first moved in. Despite her obvious exhaustion, she maintained her rigid schedule without any breaks or modifications, heading out 3 times daily no matter how worn out she appeared. I tried asking her once if she needed any help, or if there was anything I could do, but she just smiled and assured me she was fine, just keeping busy in her retirement. Her tone made it clear she didn't want to discuss her activities, so I backed off, even though I remained worried about her health and the toll her mysterious routine seemed to be taking. The breakthrough in understanding Mrs. Chen's secret life came completely by accident. I was walking through a neighbourhood about 15 blocks from our building when I spotted her sitting at a bus stop, and my curiosity finally overrode my respect for her privacy. I watched from a distance as she boarded a bus, and I impulsively caught the same bus a few doors down, sitting where I could observe her without being obvious. Mrs. Chen rode the bus for about 20 minutes before getting off in a lower income neighbourhood I'd never visited before. I followed her at a distance, feeling guilty about essentially stalking my elderly neighbour, but too invested in solving the mystery to turn back now. She walked 2 blocks and entered a community centre, a humble building with chipped paint and a small playground out front where several children were playing. I waited outside for a few minutes, debating whether to follow her inside or just go home and mind my own business. But something about the children's laughter and the warm light coming from the community centre windows made me curious enough to peek through the entrance. What I saw through the window made my throat tight with unexpected emotion. Mrs. Chen was sitting at a table surrounded by 5 children who appeared to be elementary school age. She was helping them with homework, patiently explaining a math problem to one child while another waited their turn. Her tired face was animated and joyful, completely transformed from the exhausted expression she wore in our apartment hallway. The children clearly adored her, leaning in close to hear her explanations and laughing at something she said. I later learned from a community centre staff member that Mrs. Chen had been volunteering there for over 3 years. She came every morning to help serve breakfast to families who couldn't afford it at home, tutored children in the afternoon, and returned in the evening to teach free English classes to recent immigrants. Her 3 daily trips that I'd been tracking were actually 3 separate volunteer shifts, and she did this 7 days a week without exception. But that wasn't the full story. Over the following weeks, I started noticing Mrs. Chen in other locations around the city during what I now realised were her gaps between volunteer shifts. I saw her at a nursing home, where she read books to bedridden patients. I spotted her at an animal shelter, where she socialised cats that were having trouble getting adopted. I watched her deliver meals to homeless people in the park, always stopping to talk with each person and ask about their day. Mrs. Chen wasn't just volunteering at one place. She'd constructed an entire daily schedule that allowed her to help as many different groups as possible, maximising every hour of her day to serve others. The different bags she carried made sense now, each one packed with supplies needed for that particular service activity. The craft materials were for the children's art projects at the community centre. The groceries became meals she prepared for homeless neighbours. The books were for nursing home residents who couldn't see well enough to read for themselves. I finally worked up the courage to talk to Mrs. Chen about what I'd discovered. I knocked on her door one evening and confessed that I'd followed her and learned about her volunteer work. I expected her to be angry about the invasion of privacy, but instead she just looked embarrassed and invited me in for tea. Her apartment was sparse and clearly hadn't been updated in decades. She had very little furniture, no television despite the sounds I'd heard, no computer, and almost nothing decorative on the walls. When I asked about the TV sounds I always heard, she admitted she played recordings of old movies, so neighbours would think she was home relaxing instead of worrying about her being out so much. She'd been creating the illusion of a normal retired person's life to avoid questions about her activities. Mrs. Chen explained that after her husband died 5 years ago, she'd found herself with days that felt empty and meaningless. They'd never had children. She had no close family, and she couldn't bear the thought of spending her remaining years just watching television and waiting to die. So she'd started volunteering at the community centre, and when she saw how much need existed in the city, she kept adding more service activities until her entire life became devoted to helping others. The reason she looked so exhausted was because she was spending almost every penny of her small social security check on supplies for her volunteer work and transportation costs. She barely bought food for herself, often skipping meals, so she'd have money to purchase craft supplies for the children or ingredients to cook for homeless neighbours. The weight loss I'd noticed was because she was literally giving away her own sustenance to feed others. I was horrified and moved in equal measure. Here was a 78-year-old woman sacrificing her health and comfort to help strangers, and she'd been hiding it because she thought people would try to stop her or tell her she was too old to be doing so much. She'd created an elaborate cover story of normalcy to protect her ability to keep serving. I couldn't let Mrs. Chen continue destroying her health through excessive generosity, but I also understood that her volunteer work was what gave her life meaning and purpose. So I did something that felt both presumptuous and necessary. I created a GoFundMe page explaining Mrs. Chen's story and asking for donations to support her volunteer activities so she could maintain her health while continuing to help others. The response was overwhelming. Within a week, we'd raised over $40,000 from people touched by her selflessness. Our apartment building neighbours, people from the community centre, families of nursing home residents she'd read to, and complete strangers all contributed. Local news picked up the story, and Mrs. Chen became a minor celebrity for her dedication to service. The donations allowed Mrs. Chen to continue her volunteer work, but with proper nutrition, occasional rest days, and supplies that didn't require her to sacrifice her own well-being. She was embarrassed by the attention, but grateful for the support. She hired a part-time helper to handle some of the physically demanding tasks, and she started eating regular meals again. Mrs. Chen is 80 now, and still maintains an active volunteer schedule, though slightly reduced from her previous pace. She's trained several younger volunteers to help with her various activities, creating a small army of people inspired by her example. Our apartment building started a volunteer coordination group because of her influence, and dozens of residents now participate in community service they'd never considered before meeting her. I learned that the quietest neighbours sometimes lead the most extraordinary lives, and that true generosity often hides itself behind ordinary routines and closed doors. Mrs. Chen taught me that purpose and meaning aren't things you wait to find. They're things you create through how you choose to spend your days, and that a single person's dedication to helping others can inspire an entire community to become better versions of themselves. That story shows us that the most remarkable people are often the ones who work hardest to appear unremarkable, and that sometimes our nosiest impulses can lead us to discover heroes living right across the hall who've been quietly changing the world. One small act of service at a time. Random Reddit story about a coworker. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that their annoying coworkers' constant need for attention was masking a heartbreaking situation that changed everyone's perspective completely. I worked in the customer service department of a large insurance company where my coworker Amanda had become the office's least favourite person over the course of about 6 months. Amanda was one of those people who seemed to require constant validation and attention, always interrupting conversations to share irrelevant stories about her weekend, constantly asking for help with tasks she should have been able to handle independently, and generally making herself the centre of attention whenever possible. The entire department had grown tired of her needy behaviour, and people had started avoiding her whenever they could. Amanda's attention-seeking manifested in particularly annoying ways at work. She'd dramatically sigh at her desk until someone asked what was wrong, then launch into lengthy complaints about minor inconveniences. She'd bring in elaborate homemade treats and make a huge production of distributing them, requiring individual thank yous and compliments from everyone. She'd constantly pop up at people's desks with questions that could have been answered with a quick email, clearly just looking for opportunities to chat and be noticed. What made Amanda especially frustrating was that she was actually competent at her job when she focused. She could process claims efficiently and handle difficult customers with surprising skill. But she'd sabotage her own productivity by spending half her day seeking social interaction and validation from coworkers who increasingly just wanted her to leave them alone. Our manager had spoken to her several times about maintaining professional boundaries and managing her time better, but the behaviour never really changed. The breaking point for most of the office came when Amanda started organising elaborate group activities that nobody wanted to participate in. She'd planned birthday celebrations for co-workers who preferred low-key acknowledgements, coordinate gift collections for people who'd explicitly said they didn't want office gifts, and constantly suggest team-building activities during lunch breaks when people just wanted to relax. Her heart seemed to be in the right place, but her inability to read social cues and respect people's boundaries made every interaction exhausting. I'll admit I was one of the people who actively avoided Amanda. I'd put on headphones when I saw her approaching my desk. I'd suddenly remember urgent tasks when she tried to join lunch groups. And I'd keep conversations brief and professional when interaction was unavoidable. I felt guilty about it sometimes, but Amanda's neediness was draining, and I had my own work and stress to manage without taking on her constant emotional demands. The situation that changed everything happened on a random Tuesday afternoon. Amanda had been quieter than usual that day, not engaging in her typical attention-seeking behaviours, and honestly, everyone was relieved by the break from her intensity. But around 3 p.m, she suddenly stood up from her desk, made a strange gasping sound, and collapsed onto the floor. The office erupted into chaos. Someone called for an ambulance while several of us rushed over to where Amanda had fallen. She was conscious but disoriented, and I noticed her hands were shaking uncontrollably. One of my co-workers who had first aid training checked her vital signs and tried to keep her calm while we waited for paramedics. Amanda kept apologising through tears, saying she was sorry for causing a scene and disrupting everyone's workday, which broke my heart even in the midst of the emergency. The paramedics arrived within 10 minutes and determined that Amanda's blood sugar had dropped to dangerous levels. As they were preparing to transport her to the hospital, Amanda pulled out her phone with trembling hands and made a call to someone, explaining in a shaky voice that she needed them to pick up her daughter from school because she was going to the hospital. That's when several of us realised that none of us had even known Amanda had a daughter. Our manager went to the hospital with Amanda, and what she learned there completely reframed everything we thought we knew about our annoying co-worker. Amanda was a single mother to a 7-year-old daughter who had severe autism and required constant care and supervision. Amanda's ex-husband had abandoned them 2 years earlier when he decided he couldn't handle having a special needs child, leaving Amanda to manage everything alone with no family support in the area. But the situation was even more complicated than that. Amanda's daughter had been relatively stable until about 8 months ago when she developed a serious medical condition that required expensive treatments not fully covered by insurance. Amanda had been working overtime whenever possible, taking on extra freelance work in the evenings, and skipping meals to afford her daughter's medical care and therapies. The blood sugar crash that caused her collapse was the result of Amanda not having eaten anything substantial in over 30 hours because she'd used her grocery money to pay for her daughter's occupational therapy session. The elaborate treats Amanda brought to the office weren't attention-seeking gestures. They were made from basic ingredients she could afford in bulk, and bringing them to work meant her daughter could have special homemade snacks at home. The constant interruptions and need for social interaction weren't just neediness. Amanda was drowning in isolation and stress, spending every non-work hour caring for her daughter alone, with no adult conversation or support system to help her process the overwhelming challenges she faced daily. The group activities Amanda tried to organise weren't about making herself the centre of attention. They were desperate attempts to build connections and friendships because she had no social life outside of work, and was terrified of becoming completely isolated. Every invitation she extended was a plea for human connection from someone who was spending every other moment of her life in crisis mode, trying to keep her daughter healthy and herself functioning. When our manager shared this information with the department, the collective guilt was overwhelming. We'd all been so annoyed by Amanda's behaviour that none of us had bothered to look deeper or ask if she was okay. We'd interpreted every action through the lens of annoyance, rather than considering that someone might be struggling and reaching out in the only ways they knew how. I felt absolutely terrible remembering all the times I'd avoided Amanda or cut conversations short or rolled my eyes at her attempts to connect with people. She'd been drowning and asking for help, and we'd all been too irritated by her delivery method to recognise the desperation behind it. The dramatic sighs weren't manipulation tactics, they were the sounds of someone barely holding themselves together. The constant questions weren't incompetence, they were the scattered focus of someone operating on no sleep and constant stress. The department collectively decided we needed to do better. We organised a meal train to ensure Amanda had regular food, and several co-workers volunteered to help with childcare so Amanda could have occasional breaks. We set up a fund to help with her daughter's medical expenses, and our manager worked with human resources to get Amanda connected with employee assistance programs she hadn't known existed. But more importantly, we started actually engaging with Amanda as a person, rather than treating her like an annoying obstacle to our workday. When she came by to chat, people made time for real conversations instead of brushing her off. When she brought in treats, we expressed genuine appreciation for her effort and thoughtfulness. When she seemed overwhelmed, we offered concrete help instead of just being irritated by her visible stress. The change in Amanda over the following months was remarkable. With actual support and connection, her desperate attention-seeking behaviours diminished significantly. She still enjoyed social interaction, but it became more natural and less frantic when she wasn't operating from a place of complete isolation and desperation. She became better at her job because she had the mental and emotional energy to focus. She even started leaving work on time instead of constantly volunteering for overtime because she had people willing to help with childcare. Amanda eventually told me that the months before her collapse had been the loneliest period of her entire life. She'd been watching her daughter struggle with medical issues, facing financial crisis, and feeling completely alone in managing impossible challenges. Her attempts to connect with co-workers had been her only social outlet, and having everyone avoid her had made her feel even more isolated and worthless. She'd started believing she was fundamentally unlikable and that something was wrong with her that made people not want to be around her. Learning about Amanda's situation changed how I approach all my co-workers now. When someone's behaviour seems annoying or excessive, I try to remember that people don't usually act from their best selves when they're struggling with invisible challenges. The co-worker who talks too much might be lonely. The person who seems needy might be drowning. The colleague whose work seems scattered might be dealing with overwhelming stress outside the office. Amanda is doing much better now. Her daughter's medical condition stabilised with proper treatment. The financial pressure eased with community support. And having actual friends at work transformed her mental health. She's still social and enjoys connecting with people, but the desperate quality to her interactions disappeared once she had real support and wasn't facing everything alone. That story reminds us that the most annoying people in our lives are often the ones struggling most desperately, and that taking a moment to look past irritating behaviours to see the person underneath can reveal pain and need that deserve compassion rather than avoidance, because sometimes what looks like attention seeking is actually someone asking for help in the only way they know how. Random Reddit story about a roommate. Our next story comes from someone who discovered their roommate's secret OnlyFans career in the most awkward way possible and learned that assumptions about people's choices are rarely as simple as they seem. I found my roommate Jessica through a university housing group when we were both starting graduate school. She seemed normal and responsible during our initial meeting, studying for her master's in social work while working part-time at a coffee shop to cover expenses. We signed a lease for a 2-bedroom apartment near campus, and for the first few months, everything was completely fine. Jessica kept to herself mostly, was clean and considerate about shared spaces, and we developed that comfortable roommate dynamic where you're friendly without being close friends. The first hint that something unusual was going on came when I noticed Jessica's schedule didn't quite add up. She'd mentioned being exhausted from long shifts at the coffee shop, but I'd see her car in the parking lot during times she was supposedly at work. She started spending a lot of time in her bedroom with the door locked, which was fine since everyone deserves privacy, but occasionally I'd hear her talking in there using this completely different voice than her normal speaking tone. It was higher pitched and almost performatively cheerful, like a character voice, rather than how she actually sounded. I also noticed that Jessica suddenly had a lot more money than a graduate student working part-time at a coffee shop should reasonably have. She upgraded her laptop to an expensive model, bought a professional ring light and camera equipment that she said was for a photography hobby, and started ordering takeout from nice restaurants several times a week. When I'd casually ask about her improved financial situation, she'd give vague answers about picking up extra shifts or mention that her parents had helped her out, but something about her explanations never quite felt convincing. The truth came out in the most mortifying way possible. I came home early one afternoon because a class had been cancelled, and I walked into our apartment to hear Jessica's character voice coming from her bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, which was unusual since she normally kept it firmly closed during her mysterious locked room sessions. Through the gap, I could see her sitting in front of her computer, wearing lingerie and the professional lighting equipment she'd purchased, clearly in the middle of filming or streaming something. I immediately backed away and left the apartment, feeling like I'd violated her privacy, even though it was my own home, and she'd left her door open. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, trying to process what I'd seen and figure out how to handle the situation. I wasn't judging Jessica for whatever she was doing, but we were roommates sharing an apartment, and I felt like I should have been informed if she was running some kind of adult content business from our shared living space. When I came back inside an hour later, Jessica was in the kitchen, making coffee and acting completely normal. I debated whether to bring up what I'd seen or just pretend it never happened, but living with that elephant in the room felt impossible. So I awkwardly explained that I'd come home early and accidentally seen her filming, and I wanted to talk about it not from a place of judgment, but just to understand what was happening in our shared apartment. Jessica's face went completely red, and she looked absolutely mortified. She started apologising profusely, explaining that she'd been doing OnlyFans content for about 6 months and had been terrified of me finding out because she didn't want me to think less of her or feel uncomfortable living together. She said she'd been extremely careful about keeping everything confined to her private bedroom and had no idea I'd ever come home during her filming times. What followed was one of the most honest and unexpectedly deep conversations I'd had with anyone. Jessica explained that her coffee shop job barely covered her portion of rent and basic expenses, leaving her with nothing for tuition payments, textbooks, or the therapy she needed to manage her anxiety and depression. She'd been facing the choice between taking on massive student loans that would burden her for decades, or finding a way to make significantly more money while still having time for her demanding graduate program. She'd researched OnlyFans after a friend mentioned it as a legitimate income option, and she'd approached it thoughtfully and carefully. She created content that she was comfortable with, set firm boundaries about what she would and wouldn't do, and treated it like the professional business it was. Within 2 months, she was making more than she'd made in 6 months at the coffee shop, and for the first time in her adult life, she wasn't constantly stressed about money. But what really struck me was when Jessica started crying while explaining the shame and fear she carried about her choice. She was studying to be a social worker, planning to devote her career to helping vulnerable people, and she was terrified that if anyone in her professional network discovered her OnlyFans work, her entire career would be destroyed before it even started. She lived in constant anxiety about being discovered, judged, or having her educational and professional goals derailed because of how she was funding them. Jessica also explained the emotional complexity of the work itself. It wasn't just easy money for doing nothing, as people often assumed. She spent hours researching what content performed well, learned photography and video editing skills, managed her own marketing and subscriber communication, and dealt with disturbing messages from subscribers who felt entitled to her time and attention beyond what she offered. She maintained strict boundaries between her online persona and her real identity, never showing her face in content and using a completely different name online. The conversation completely changed my perspective on both Jessica and the broader topic of sex work and online content creation. I'd had vague judgmental thoughts about people who did OnlyFans, assuming it was either desperate or morally questionable. But hearing Jessica's thoughtful reasoning and understanding the economic pressures that led to her choice made me realise how simplistic and unfair those assumptions were. We established some ground rules after that conversation. Jessica would make absolutely sure her door was locked during filming times and would text me her schedule so I'd know when to expect her to be working. She'd keep all her equipment and work materials confined to her private bedroom, so there was clear separation between her business and our shared living spaces. And most importantly, we agreed that her OnlyFans work was her private business, and I wouldn't share that information with anyone, protecting her privacy and future career prospects. Living with Jessica, after learning her secret, actually made us closer friends. She'd occasionally talk about the bizarre and sometimes disturbing aspects of her work, like subscribers who tried to manipulate her into providing free content, or people who became obsessively fixated on discovering her real identity. She dealt with the same workplace stress and difficult customers any service worker faces, but with the added complexity that her work was stigmatized and could damage her reputation if discovered. I also gained insight into how much actual work went into Jessica's content creation. She was constantly planning shoots, editing videos, managing her subscriber base, and staying current with platform algorithms and trends. It was genuinely entrepreneurial and required skills that would be valuable in any business context. She was running a small business while completing a demanding graduate program which required incredible time management and discipline. The most surprising aspect of the whole situation was how Jessica's OnlyFans work actually aligned with her social work values in unexpected ways. She'd talk about subscribers who were lonely or socially isolated, who treated her content and interactions as a form of connection they couldn't find elsewhere. She maintained compassionate boundaries while recognizing that she was providing something that genuinely helped certain people feel less alone. It wasn't the social work career she was training for, but it involved many of the same skills around boundaries, empathy, and understanding human needs. Jessica graduated last year with her master's in social work, debt-free because of her OnlyFans income. She closed down her account after accepting a position at a non-profit organisation working with at-risk youth. She told me that while she was grateful for the financial security her content creation provided, she was also relieved to leave that chapter of her life behind and focus entirely on her chosen career without the constant fear of being discovered and judged. Before she moved out to start her new job in another city, Jessica thanked me for not judging her when I discovered her secret and for treating her choice with respect and understanding rather than shame or disgust. She said that having one person in her life who knew her complete situation and didn't condemn her for it had made the emotional burden of her work significantly more manageable during those years. The experience taught me that people's choices about how they support themselves financially are often far more complex and thoughtful than outsiders assume. Jessica wasn't a victim or morally compromised because she did OnlyFans. She was a smart, capable person making strategic decisions about how to fund her education and career goals without drowning in debt. The real problem wasn't her choice, but the economic system that forced graduate students into impossible financial situations where unconventional income sources became the most rational option. That story shows us that the people we live with often carry secrets and complexities we never imagine, and that responding to those revelations with curiosity and compassion rather than judgment can transform both our relationships and our understanding of how people navigate difficult choices in an economy that makes traditional paths increasingly unaffordable for many. Random Reddit story about a neighbour. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that their neighbour's bizarre obsession with a Korean pop group was actually the key to solving a mystery that had been plaguing their entire apartment building for months. I moved into my apartment building about a year ago and immediately noticed my neighbour Clive because of the constant music blasting from his unit at all hours. But this wasn't just any music. It was exclusively one Korean pop group called Demon Hunter, and Clive played their songs on repeat so loudly that I could hear every word through our shared wall. At first I thought it was just a phase, or maybe he was a casual fan who'd gotten really into their music, but as weeks turned into months, Clive's obsession reached levels that seemed genuinely concerning. Clive covered his apartment door with printed photos of the 5 Demon Hunter members, creating this shrine-like collage that greeted anyone walking down our hallway. He wore exclusively Demon Hunter merchandise, rotating through what must have been 30 different band shirts, hoodies, and even pajama pants featuring their logo and member photos. His car was decorated with Demon Hunter bumper stickers and window decals to the point where it looked like a mobile advertisement for the group. Every single conversation I had with Clive somehow circled back to Demon Hunter within 3 sentences, regardless of what topic we'd started with. What made Clive's obsession particularly strange was that he was a 42-year-old accountant who otherwise seemed completely normal and professional. He worked regular hours at a respected firm downtown, maintained his apartment reasonably well, and was generally polite to neighbours despite the noise complaints. The Demon Hunter fixation seemed completely disconnected from the rest of his personality and life, like he'd become possessed by fandom in a way that didn't match anything else about him. The music volume was a constant source of tension in the building. Clive would play Demon Hunter songs starting at 6 in the morning and continuing until midnight or later, always at a volume that made walls vibrate and made it impossible for neighbours to have normal conversations in their own homes. Multiple people had complained to building management, and Clive had received several noise violation warnings, but he'd just turned the music down for a day or two before gradually increasing the volume back to its previous levels. What really concerned me was Clive's behaviour during what I can only describe as his Demon Hunter ritual hours. Every evening between 9 and 10, he'd play their music even louder than usual, and I could hear him through the wall doing what sounded like some kind of choreographed routine. There'd be rhythmic stomping, furniture being moved around, and occasionally Clive singing along in Korean, despite clearly not speaking the language fluently. The whole performance had this frantic, obsessive quality that felt less like enjoying music and more like conducting some kind of ceremony. I tried talking to Clive directly about the noise several times, approaching it from different angles. I'd mention that I had early morning meetings and needed sleep. I'd suggest he use headphones for late night listening. I'd even try bonding over music by asking about Demon Hunter and why he loved them so much. But Clive's responses were always intense and slightly unsettling. He'd launch into monologues about how Demon Hunter's music contained hidden messages and protective frequencies, how their lyrics revealed truths that most people couldn't understand, and how listening to their songs at specific volumes and times was absolutely essential for reasons he couldn't fully explain. The situation escalated when strange things started happening in the building that seemed connected to Clive's demon hunter obsession. We'd find demon hunter lyrics printed on small cards and slipped under various apartment doors, always in the middle of the night when no one was around to see who was distributing them. The lyrics were highlighted in specific patterns that didn't make obvious sense, with certain words circled or underlined as if they were meant to convey some coded message. Then residents started reporting that their packages were being opened and resealed, but nothing was ever stolen. The packages would arrive, sit in the mail room for a few hours, and then be found with their tape carefully removed and replaced, contents untouched but clearly disturbed. Building management installed cameras in the mailroom, but whoever was opening the packages knew exactly where the cameras were positioned and managed to avoid being captured on video. The final strange occurrence was a series of symbols that appeared on the building's exterior walls, spray-painted in silver paint during the middle of the night. The symbols looked vaguely like Korean characters, but weren't quite right, like someone had tried to recreate Hangul from memory without actually understanding the writing system. They appeared in a pattern around the building's perimeter, always at exactly the same height from the ground, as if someone had carefully measured their placement. I started to suspect Clive might be behind these mysterious incidents because of his obvious obsession with everything Korean and his increasingly erratic behaviour. But I couldn't figure out what his motivation would be, or what he was trying to accomplish with the strange messages and package tampering. The whole situation felt like it was building towards something, but I couldn't understand what. The truth came out in the most unexpected way during a building-wide meeting called to address the ongoing mysteries and Clive's noise violations. About 20 residents gathered in the community room to discuss solutions, and Clive attended looking nervous and fidgety. The building manager was in the middle of explaining new security measures when Clive suddenly stood up and made an announcement that silenced the entire room. Clive explained that everything he'd been doing for the past 8 months, the loud music, the lyrics distribution, the package inspection, and even the spray-painted symbols, had been part of an elaborate investigation into a package theft ring operating in our building. He revealed that he wasn't actually obsessed with Demon Hunter at all. He was an undercover investigator working with local police to identify and catch a sophisticated group that had been stealing high-value packages from multiple apartment buildings in our neighbourhood. The Demon Hunter obsession had been his cover story, deliberately designed to make him seem harmless and eccentric rather than threatening. He'd needed an explanation for being home at unusual hours, for paying close attention to building activity, and for behaviour that might otherwise seem suspicious. By creating the persona of an obsessive K-pop fan, he'd been able to conduct surveillance and investigation without anyone suspecting his real purpose. The loud music had served multiple functions in his investigation. It established his cover identity and gave him an excuse to be awake and active during the hours when package thefts typically occurred. It also masked sounds of him moving around his apartment to monitor hallway activity, and the predictable schedule of his music helped him track patterns in building traffic because he'd notice when people altered their routines to avoid his noise. The lyrics cards he'd been distributing weren't random K-pop messages, but actually contained coded information for other officers involved in the investigation. The highlighted patterns corresponded to apartment numbers and times when suspicious activity had been observed. The package inspections hadn't been tampering, but careful documentation of shipping labels and contents to identify patterns in what was being targeted by thieves. The spray-painted symbols that looked like corrupted Korean characters were actually markers indicating camera blind spots and entry points the theft ring was using. Clive had been mapping their operation methods by marking the physical evidence of their activity around the building's perimeter. Clive's presentation included detailed evidence showing that a group of 3 people, including 1 building resident and 2 accomplices from outside, had been stealing packages worth over $50,000 from our building and several others nearby. They'd been targeting electronics, designer clothing, and other high-value items that could be quickly resold. The police had been building a case for months, and Clive's undercover work in our building had provided crucial evidence that led to arrests just days before our meeting. The room was absolutely stunned. We'd all been so annoyed by Clive's apparent demon hunter obsession that no one had suspected it was an elaborate investigative cover. The building manager apologised for not being able to tell residents what was really happening, explaining that maintaining Clive's cover had been essential to the investigation's success. Several neighbours who'd filed noise complaints against Clive now felt guilty for not understanding the bigger picture. Clive apologised for the disruption and noise he'd caused over the months, explaining that maintaining a convincing cover required committing fully to the obsessive fan persona. He'd actually grown to genuinely enjoy some of Demon Hunter's music during the investigation, which he said was an unexpected side effect of listening to their songs hundreds of times while pretending to be their biggest fan. The package theft ring was successfully prosecuted thanks in large part to Clive's work, and dozens of stolen packages were recovered and returned to victims across multiple buildings. Our building's theft problem disappeared completely after the arrests, and residents could finally receive deliveries without worrying about losing valuable items. Clive moved out of the building shortly after his investigation concluded, transferring to a new undercover assignment in a different neighbourhood. Before he left, several neighbours threw him a thank you party where we ironically played Demon Hunter music and gave him gag gifts of K-pop merchandise. He laughed and admitted that he'd miss his fake obsession a little bit, and that the investigation had given him genuine appreciation for Korean pop music, even if he'd never actually been the fanatic he'd pretended to be. The experience taught our entire building a valuable lesson about judging people based on surface behaviours without understanding their context or motivations. We'd all been so focused on being annoyed by Clive's noise and bizarre obsession that we'd completely missed the dedicated professional work he was doing to protect our community. His willingness to endure months of neighbour complaints and building violations to maintain his cover demonstrated a level of commitment that earned everyone's respect once the truth came out. I still think about Clive whenever I hear K-pop music now, remembering the neighbour who seemed absolutely unhinged but was actually one of the most dedicated and clever investigators I've ever encountered. His fake demon hunter obsession became legendary in our building, a reminder that sometimes the most annoying neighbours are actually heroes in disguise, conducting important work that requires them to appear as something completely different from who they really are. That story reminds us that the people whose behaviour seems most inexplicable often have reasons and motivations we can't begin to guess, and that patience and curiosity about why someone acts the way they do can reveal layers of complexity and purpose that transform our entire understanding of who they are and what they're trying to accomplish. Our final story is about someone who found out their neighbour had been stealing packages and decided to give them a lesson in karma they'd never forget. My neighbour, Travis, had been quietly pilfering packages from porches all over our street for months before I figured it out. He lived 3 houses down and always came off as the friendly, chatty type, waving when I mowed the lawn or stopping by to complain about his missing deliveries. The irony didn't escape me later. The thefts had gotten out of hand. Half the neighbourhood had installed doorbell cameras after losing pricey items. Whoever was doing it seemed to know delivery schedules down to the hour. I started suspecting Travis when I realised his house was mysteriously immune to the theft problem. While everyone else kept losing packages, his deliveries always showed up untouched. Then I noticed he suddenly had a bunch of gadgets, tools and decor that looked suspiciously similar to things others had reported stolen. "Got a great deal online," he'd say with a grin. "Sure you did." My confirmation came when I set up a hidden camera after one of my own deliveries vanished, a box of expensive headphones I'd been waiting for. The footage showed Travis strolling right up to my porch in broad daylight, glancing around and casually taking the package. He tucked it under his arm like it was his own and walked straight home. I didn't confront him, not yet. I decided to make the next delivery one he'd truly regret stealing. I ordered a similar-looking box and rigged it before it arrived. Inside was a small GPS tracker, a homemade glitter bomb wired to a timer, and a Bluetooth speaker programmed to emit obnoxious, random noises, from baby cries to bagpipe blasts. I topped it off with a note that read, "Enjoy your brand new box of chaos. This device activates at random for the next 7 days. Glitter is permanent. Choices have consequences." When the package arrived, I set my cameras and waited. Sure enough, within 2 hours, Travis did his usual sneaky walk and grab routine. The first activation happened that evening. From my window, I heard a loud, distorted air horn sound, blaring from his house, followed by yelling and something crashing to the floor. The glitter device triggered soon after. A visible cloud of shimmering particles burst through his open blinds. It was beautiful. Over the next week, his life turned into a glittery nightmare. Every few hours, that speaker would blare some random, obnoxious sound. Sometimes a screaming goat, sometimes a siren, sometimes static at full volume. He couldn't sleep, couldn't relax, and definitely couldn't figure out where the sounds were coming from. His living room sparkled like a disco ball from all the glitter. I'd see him through his window, red-eyed, pacing around with cleaning rags and a look of pure exhaustion. The best part? He couldn't tell anyone. Calling the police or a repairman would mean confessing that he'd stolen the box in the first place. When I saw him outside one morning, still covered in flecks of glitter, he asked if I'd been hearing weird noises lately. Said he thought the power lines were interfering with his electronics. I acted sympathetic and told him it might be a wiring issue. He nodded miserably and walked off. A few days later, I decided it was time to end the performance. I printed a screenshot from my security footage. Travis caught red-handed taking my package and walked to his door. He opened it looking like he hadn't slept in days. Glitter was still in his hair. The faint sound of bagpipes could be heard from somewhere inside. I handed him the photo and told him calmly that I knew exactly what he'd been doing. He could either confess and make things right with the neighbours, or I'd hand the footage to the police. He went pale. At first he tried to deny it, but the evidence and his current sparkly condition made it impossible. A week later, he called a neighbourhood meeting. Everyone showed up, curious. There he stood, shimmering under the streetlights, still occasionally interrupted by a faint electronic shriek from the cursed box, and confessed to stealing packages. He promised to pay back what he'd taken and return what he could. The collective mix of laughter and disbelief was priceless. Once he'd made amends, I remotely deactivated the devices. The glitter, though, was permanent. You could still see traces of it weeks later, shining in his curtains and carpet whenever the sun hit just right. Travis moved out a couple of months later. Apparently, he couldn't handle living in the same place where everyone knew what he'd done. Since then, no one's lost a package. The neighbourhood feels peaceful again, and a little bit smug if I'm honest. That story's over. The week-long torment of random glitter bombs and unpredictable noise was pure poetic justice, especially knowing Travis couldn't ask for help without outing himself as a thief. The image of him trying to have normal conversations while covered in glitter and interrupted by sound effects still cracks me up. Thieves never expect their victims to fight back with creativity, but sometimes the best revenge isn't anger, it's art.